Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to those of us joining from Brazil. But I think generally it's either good morning or good afternoon. It's really great to be convening this policy roundtable at the very beginning of the year, and a day after we had, I think, a very successful set of discussions around a 3.5-year project that SIRE, together with other African partners, have been undertaking on macroeconomic responses to the COVID pandemic in a number of African countries. And the word that dominated in those conversations was resilience, or two words: was resilience and vulnerability. And I think these are some of the key overarching themes in any discussion around global economic governance these days. The policy roundtable today is really intended to be a first set of discussions. At least in this year, we've had numerous ones last year. Given now that the African Union is a permanent member of the G20, G21. We'd like to call it G21, but I understand we're sticking with the G20 formally. The AU is a member, but more importantly also South Africa, which until last year was the only African member in the G20, is now part of the Troika, officially from the 1st of December 2023, and we take over the presidency at the end of this year on the 1st of December 2024. For a number of years, the South African Institute of International Affairs, together with IDOS, and we'll be hearing from Sven representing IDOS just now, has been convening a number of African think tanks to discuss G20 issues, exactly because even before the AU was a member of the G20, we believed fundamentally that the discussions in the G20 and the decisions had a significant impact on Africa's developmental trajectory, and therefore African think tanks needed to engage with the topics, even if the countries from which these think tanks came were not necessarily represented in the G20. And so we had an informal network that we call the Think 20 Africa Standing Group. Over the course of the last several years, we've also produced policy briefings that touch on a number of important themes that are priorities for the continent. And we've also been quite engaged in the formal Think 20 process, which this year is chaired by Brazil, and where a number of African representatives, and that's really great to see, a number of African representatives are actually either in co-chairing or co-chairing or leading sub-themes within the task forces that the T20 has established. This roundtable, therefore, is really a first opportunity in 2024 to reflect on some of the pressing issues on the African agenda, how the African think tank community can come together to provide African-generated policy inputs, recommendations to both the African Union, but also to South Africa where necessary, where appropriate, and also to play, I think, an important role in building capacity on the continent and building engagement with various important African stakeholders on global economic governance issues as they are channeled through the G20. So both here around the table and virtually, we have a number of think tanks that have been involved in this process, some of them more recently, but welcome to you all. Let me stop here. I'll be making additional remarks a little later, and I'll also, well, let me say now, it's great to have the Brazilian Sous Sherpa online, Flavio Pacetta, as well as the South African Sous Sherpa next to me, and also the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa online, Hanan Morsi, but we'll also be introducing them each in turn in the first session. Let me hand over now to my colleague Sven Grimm from the Institute for Development and Sustainability in Bonn, previously known as the German Development Institute, who has been our partner in many of these endeavors over the last several years. Over to you, Sven.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and greetings from afar. Very nice to be virtually present, and I see that as one of the very few positive impacts of the pandemic, that we're having sessions across 3 continents now in a virtual space. It became more normal, so that's very, very good, and I very much appreciate. It's different from being there, so I'll engage with the discussion as much as I can from here, and looking forward to more of the engagement. I wanted to also recall what the G20 Africa Standing Group's mandate was, and then reflect a little bit on what we are doing in this. Saya sent around this overview of the T20 Africa Group, and there were actually 2 goals stated there. One was to facilitate the articulation of African views in the G20 and global governance issues. And the second one was to amplify those views, make them heard. While the African Union is now a member of the G20, I think that has shifted dynamics a little bit. There's an additional focal point for these views being facilitated and being put forward in the G20. The amplification, I think, is still something to engage in, and that refers back to the discussion yesterday, Ibrahim Mayaki saying the strategic engagement becoming more relevant. While sitting at the table, understanding dynamics, engaging with dynamics at the table, seeing opportunities, yes, formulating own viewpoints, that is something that is happening very much on the African continent, but also engaging strategically to make these views heard and impactful. And I just wanted to highlight 2 points here. One, starting with a confession that I was absolutely wrong in seeing the G7 become less irrelevant. Less relevant maybe, but irrelevant. I saw them as, when the G20 was formed, the G7 to be a bit redundant, and why would we want to have a G7? Now, geopolitical dynamics have changed that setting slightly, and make the G7 more for a club within the G20 where European and North American countries plus Japan organize views, and it's more the democracy club they call themselves. We might like them or not like them, but they are still impactful. And I think for dynamics, we need to be aware that Italy currently has the G7 presidency. It's actually an ongoing procedure of passing over while we are in this setting, that the Italians take over the G7 presidency. And there is some opportunities and some limitations in the engagement with Africa. Yesterday, there was a bigger EU-Africa summit in Rome, and it highlighted how much the Italians put an emphasis in their G7 presidency on EU-Africa relations. It also highlights, I think, the aspect of migration being a very core issue for a right-wing government in Rome. It holds opportunities and limitations at the same time for engagement with Africa. For the second half of the year, we probably have more challenges, because we will see dynamics G7, we will see EU elections with a more likely right-wing twist to it, and that will reduce funding or channel it to certain topics. Migration is not going to go away as a topic, and that's one thing to keep in mind when you talk about sustainable development on the African continent, how to make an argument that convinces European partners. And the second point that I wanted to raise, and that's more of a scary point also from a European perspective, is the 5th of November, when we see elections in the US and the likeliness, the possibility at least, of a Trump 2 administration, which again would have effects globally, but also on the African discussion, because money will dry up in the Western world. Europe will shift priorities if that happens, needing to channel money more into conflicts in its neighborhood. The Ukraine war will need more attention and money, so that will be another downfall. I'm mentioning those two things to keep them in mind. You can have other issues to consider here. Obviously, G20 is broader than Europe and the North American context. There is much more going on. We have a Southern presidency chain at the moment. But keeping those dynamics in mind will help to make more benefit, I think, out of the Southernization of the G20. Last but not least, I think one of the points to consider is how and where to engage. I'm very much a person on international relations, not so much the economic side. Obviously, economics is a key priority for Africa, but international relations is as well. And so how to engage in various task forces of the Brazilian presidency, how to make opinions, voices, analysis, and recommendations from the African continent heard in those contexts, I think is a key point. And I'm looking forward to hearing more on that as well in the course of our meeting on the G20 presidency priorities from Brazil. I'm very much looking forward to engaging, and thank you very much for giving me the floor as a start, Elizabeth. I'm handing back to you.
Great, thanks very much, Sven. Now it's great to ask Pamela Gopal from the African Union Development Agency, Ouder NEPAD, with whom and IDOS we are co-hosting this meeting, to also say a few words.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And following your cue, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this T20 Africa Standing Group Policy Roundtable session, co-hosted by the African Union Development Agency and SAIA. Both African Development Agency and SAIA, we understand that we cannot do this alone. And this dialogue certainly facilitates our united objectives towards Africa's development. The AUDA NEPAD has the key responsibility to monitor and evaluate Agenda 2063. So we need to reflect and demonstrate acquired knowledge for our leadership support structure, as well as partners and, more importantly, African ownership. We are aware that regional and national content from African think tanks is diverse, but often inaccessible to policymakers. Our work with think tanks is essential as their expertise lies in generating knowledge, to influence policy development and to review them. The Policy Bridge Tank program at AUDA NEPAD ensures that evidence-based knowledge is disseminated to policymakers towards the realization of policy into practice. This is indeed an historic occasion, as it is the first meeting of the T20 African Standing Group since the AU has joined the group. Is a network of think tanks from Africa and G20 countries that provides policy advice and global sustainable development issues. SAIA is an independent research institute that produces cutting-edge analysis on Africa's international relations It also hosts the G20 Africa Monitor, which is a platform that tracks the impact of the G20 initiatives on Africa. SAIA's vision is certainly aligned with ours to promote a prosperous, open, and inclusive Africa in a changing global order. The T20 African Standing Group focuses on cooperation between Africa and G20 countries on key topics such as infrastructure, agriculture, financing, to just name a few. And we believe that these topics are crucial for achieving the SDGs as well as the Agenda 2063 by enhancing Africa's role and voice in global governance. We are living in a time of transition where the old ways of doing things are no longer working for us. The business as usual model is outdated and unfit for the complex and dynamic challenges we face today. And, it somehow feels like an old machine that has been running for far too long that is now breaking down. However, we also have a vision for a better future. A future that is more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. A future that is aligned with our values and our aspirations. It is like a seed that is being planted, and this is waiting to sprout and grow into a magnificent tree. And this is how we look at the African Standing Group in which we want to engage these new discussions with. We may not know exactly what this future would look like, as there are many uncertainties and unknowns, but we can sense the direction and the magnitude of change that is needed. We can see the signs of this future in the present, in the innovation and creative initiatives that we are emerging in various domains and sectors. One of the key drivers of this change is regional integration, as we heard yesterday, which is essential for Africa's development and prosperity. We recognize that many of the problems we face cannot be solved by individual countries alone, but require collective action and cooperation. And we are committed to working together as a region to leverage our strengths and opportunities and to overcome our challenges and threats. In order to fully benefit from our membership in the G20 and from the various initiatives and strategies that are being developed for Africa, we must also invest in our internal systems and capacity. We must build a strong and coherent AU that can leverage its new status and influence, that can engage strategically and effectively with our stakeholders. We are here today to exchange ideas and perspectives on the development issues that matter for Africa's global representation. And we're also here to bridge this gap between research and policy and to contribute to the global policy dialogue. We focus on evidence utilization through interactive consultations like this one, providing mechanisms to operationalize and monitor key objectives with a focus on building our own African knowledge. For example, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a flagship program of the Agenda 2063, and it certainly has the potential to transform Africa into a global powerhouse. So we need to support and monitor its implementation and its impact. With these words, I would like to wish all of us successful deliberations and welcome once again. Thank you for your participation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Pamela. So I think we'll just move straight on then, right, to the next session, where Pamela, you are actually moderating. So you just carry on as you were.
Great, so thank you. And in following also the style and pattern of yesterday's engagement, I think we're not going to be reading bios, which, as Maeva said, you can Google that. So We go straight on to the presentations, and the session is AU in the G20 from Brazil to South Africa. And our presenters for today is Flavio Pizzetto, who we have just heard now, the Brazilian G20 Sherpa, will join Sushapa, sorry, who will join us virtually. We also have two other virtual participants, which is Alex Redebe, who is the Chief of Staff at the African Union, the Office of the Chairperson.
I know that.
He's not coming in?
That's my mistake. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So my apologies for Alex. He couldn't be present this afternoon. And then we have from UNICA, Hannah Morse. And we have in the room, and very privileged to have his presence, Ambassador Zolini Mohego, also of the G20 Sushapa from DIRCO, which is the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa. So I just hand over now to Flavio, who can also make your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. I hope you all can hear me. Is it all right?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Brazilian Sherpa, Ambassador Mauricio Lido, I would like to thank very much SAIA for convening this meeting and for inviting Brazil to take part in this very important discussion. We're honored to engage with an entity that I understand will play a key role this year in the preparation for the South African presidency next year. And I understand next year during the T20, we have here in Brazil a big process going on already with events prepared, events being announced for the T20 under the Brazilian presidency. It's very, very nice to engage with SAIA, knowing that it will take a big part in next year's T20. I would like to start my presentation picking up two comments from, actually three comments. The first one from Sven. Sven mentioned the Southern Presidency chain in the G20. This is something very important. And Elizabeth and Pamela mentioned the importance of the agenda in the G20. Elizabeth mentioned the idea of having an Africa-centered policy recommendations, and Pamela, the African ownership of the agenda, a strong AU that can leverage its new role in the group. This is really important for what I would like to share with you, a Brazilian perspective with relation to these two issues: the chain of presidencies from the South and the agenda in the G20. Brazil is having the privilege of chairing the G20 in the middle of a sequence of 4 developing countries as presidents of the group. So we had Indonesia in 2022, India in 2023, Brazil this year, and next year, 2025, we'll have South Africa. Nowadays, we tend to take for granted that the G20 is a group of the biggest economies in the planet, as if that criteria is behind its creation as a group. Indeed, the G20 brings together the biggest economies in the planet, but to be very frank, the origins of the group are not related to size. The origins of the group are more likely related to economic interest than to economic size. So if you we all recall, the G20 was formed in the late 1990s, so in 1999, essentially after a sequence of crises in emerging markets. So we had the Mexican peso crisis in 1995. We had the Asian financial crisis in 1997, the Russian stock market crash in 1998, and the Brazilian currency devaluation in 1999. The originator of the idea of bringing together a group of emerging economies that back in the 1990s were, let's say, in crisis, and the traditional advanced economies group, the G7, which had been formed in the 1970s, was actually the Canadian Finance Minister, Paul Martin. He defended the case that the mismanagement of certain emerging economies, economies in what we call nowadays the global south, could present problems to the central economies, to the economies around the G7. So the idea was to bring in this group of emerging economies into the main global governance body of economic affairs, not because these economies were big, but because their policies were consequential to the international economics. So that was behind the creation of the G20 back in the 1990s. Later on, the G20 changed its configuration. It became from a purely financial entity, it became a more political entity in the late 2000s. But the origins of the group are mostly related to the management of the global economy from a central perspective. So from the perspective of developed economies. So that is why, for instance, economies in Africa, such as Nigeria, Egypt, which are big economies in the continent, are not present in the G20. South Africa, which is a big economy, was and is more consequential to the international economy than Nigeria and Egypt. That perception probably has changed, but the fact is, what formed the group was not size. What formed the group was interest. The interest of having economic policies most likely in this emerging market side of the planet, which back then in the 90s was in crisis, been brought into the main economic body of economic governance in the planet. Why does that matter nowadays? That matters nowadays because even when the G20 was reconfigured to become a more political entity, 10 years after Paul Martin, 10 years after it was formed, the agenda of the G20 has been very, very much centered around the developed economy. So having said that, I would like to come back to what Sven mentioned about this Southern presidency change. Why does this Southern presidency change matter? It matters because the years of 2022 to 2025 are the years when developing countries have a chance to formulate an agenda for the G20, which can be said, let's say, bring into the center of the main body of global governance matters of interest to developing countries. This is really important. This has been behind let's say, the formulation of the Brazilian priorities for its presidency this year. So I'll just briefly mention them. You will see in each of these priorities something which is related to Brazil itself, to matters that are close to the Brazilian hearts, let's say, and something which is, let's say, the Brazilian views of what could be a common agenda for all developing countries. So we have circulated one concept note in December plus 18 issue notes, one for each part of the G20, all aimed at presenting what are Brazil's views for the group this year, what the group should achieve this year. And these position papers, let's say, all revolve around three priorities. So the three selected priorities for the Brazilian G20 presidency. The number one priority, social inclusion and the fight against hunger and poverty. The number two priority, energy transitions and sustainable development. And this is a key priority for Brazil. I may come back to it later. And the third priority, the reform of global governance institutions, something that we see the G20 could work together on, something that we see that developing countries have a lot to push for, because there are many issues, many matters which are close to our interest here, and Brazil thinks that this should be at the core, at the center of the G20 this year. This is very much, let's say, a Brazilian perspective of what could be a developing country agenda for the G20. As I said, there's a lot about Brazil in this agenda. There's a lot about our reading of what could be a common interest in the global South. And there's also things missing there. Something that I believe is missing there is a proper African agenda for the group. This is something that to be very frank, Brazil can have ideas about, but I believe the right moment for that will be next year. It will be the moment when South Africa, the first time an African country will preside the G20. Brazil is the third Latin American country presiding the G20. We had Mexico many years ago, we had Argentina some years ago, and now we have Brazil. South Africa will be the first African president of the group next year, and I have no doubt that Brazil will be there in the Troika to support the South African priorities, which I'm sure will reflect a continental priority, a continental agenda for the group. And I'm very happy to see Ambassador Solisa taking part in this panel. I'm glad to have him together with us in this session. And I think for a start, that's it from me. Thank you very much once again, and I'll be happy to engage more if you have questions about how Brazil plans to push the agenda of the group ahead this year. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Flavio, for articulating this contextual approach that has been taken by the Brazilian G20 and, alluding to the emerging economies that were consequential of the emerging, economies that are central to development economies and also aligned to the interest of economic governance. So thank you very much. And I also want to congratulate Brazil, I think, for coordinating a lot in such short notice as you have taken over from India. You're doing an excellent job at including all stakeholders and of course having an inclusive approach for the African agenda. So thank you very much for your intervention. We'll move on to now in the room. We have Ambassador Mahogo. Over to you, sir, Ambassador. Thank you.
Good afternoon. And I must also start by thanking you, the organizers of this meeting, for inviting us to share our initial thinking about the G20 and South Africa. Let me say that these types of meetings are obviously very timely because in government we are at the stage of trying to outline and develop priorities for our 2025 presidency. And through that process, we hope that we will collaborate with you, with the T20 and other stakeholders to help us think through what would be the priorities for South Africa. We will be in Addis Ababa in a few weeks' time for the AU Summit in 2024, and that is part of the discussion there. We'll also focus on the role of the AU in the G20. In fact, this week, the Permanent Representatives Council, the ambassadors in Addis, are already discussing that. There is a resolution that has been presented to the PRC about the role of the AU, focusing mainly at this stage on the modalities. For example, when you talk about the AU, there are obviously two schools of thought. Some people think that the AU should be represented by the country that is chairing the AU on a particular year. But I think for consistency, there is also a view which South Africa holds that it should actually be the commissioners who play a key role for continuity and just to manage the process. So that discussion is taking place now in Addis Ababa, and it will be finalized by the heads of state and government when they get a report of the PRC and the Executive Council. And then, of course, there was mention earlier by Pamela of the Agenda 2063. As you all know, we are now getting to the stage of the second 10-year implementation plan for Agenda 2063. So we had a retreat in Kigali in October, a foreign ministers retreat, to look at the experiences with the first 10-year plan. and then to start laying the seed for the second 10-year plan. So we hope again that this upcoming summit of the AU will endorse the second 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063. And naturally, this means that the priorities that South Africa and the African Union may bring to the G20 will be informed by Agenda 2063 because it is the continental blueprint for development. So I think we will draw a lot from Agenda 2063 as we prepare our priorities. So let me just, against that background, I think I will talk more about how we see the G20 as South Africa. And I must also just refer to what has been said by Flavio about the presidencies of the South that are leading the G20 over this 4-year period. I think our first thought as South Africa is that we will have continuity with Indonesia, India, and Brazil. And I think that is natural because all these countries face similar challenges. The development agenda is on the top of our thinking. So to the extent that India and Indonesia laid the ground, and now when we look at the 3 priorities of Brazil, they are firmly also on the development agenda. And I think South Africa so that is what we are thinking now, that we will have that continuity. And in any case, some of the themes, such as the reform of global governance, the reform of the multilateral development banks, are ongoing processes. So they will never be complete under one presidency. But I think our role is then to see what has Indonesia and India achieved, what will Brazil achieve this year, and then we develop on that. Certainly we have to take a development focus and bring it into the G20. We have to, as Flavio was saying, we have to have a very strong African agenda in our presidency. Hence, I was talking earlier about Agenda 2063. You know all the flagship projects that are there, including the ACFTA that was mentioned by Pamela. So that is basically at a high level our approach. But we see the G20 as South Africa as a very important vehicle, therefore, to advance the developing countries' agenda and our development priorities. As a premier forum for international economic cooperation, the G20 plays an important role in advancing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And I think in this context, we should also recall that when South Africa chairs next year, we will be left with 5 years before 2030. So naturally, we will have to reflect on that during our presidency. And I think of many international meetings that will take place around the world next year will have this focus of the fact that we'll be left with only 5 years before 2030. So we view the G20 that it has become a preeminent global agenda setting body in international relations outside of the formal UN structures. The discussions of the G20 often reflect the foremost global political and economic challenges at any given time. And therefore, as a collective body, it tends to carry a significant profile and influence. However, the role of the G20 countries continues to evolve. Of late, we see that its agenda has expanded beyond economic and financial issues. Now, sometimes we discuss in the G20 peace and security issues. So this is, I think, Joseph Hilder may also comment on this, on how we've been seeing peace and security issues coming through the G20, including in the DWD that she shares. So therefore, as I've said before, for South Africa, it is important that the G20 should continue to prioritize, to have a development focus and look after the interests of developing countries. I will not talk about the 3 presidencies, 4 presidencies. Flavio has already spoken about that. But just to pick up on some of the discussions from the India presidency, you will notice that there was a lot of focus on the reform of the multilateral development banks, an agenda that South Africa also supports. So if you look at the New Delhi Declaration, there our leaders emphasize the responsibilities of multilateral development banks have in development financing for the implementation of the SDGs, with a special focus on poverty eradication. Furthermore, the New Delhi Declaration highlighted the need of the reform of the MDPs to align their response to the global challenges and extend adequate finance. The wording of the New Delhi Declaration that we negotiated says that the MDPs must be bigger, better, and more impactful. And I think just to show again the continuity that I was talking about, during the New Delhi summit, President Ramaphosa and President Biden and the Prime Minister of India and the President of the World Bank, they got together and signed up to a one-paragraph statement basically endorsing the agenda of reforming the MDPs. So that was significant because, as you know, after South Africa, it will be the United States that will chair the G20. So therefore, that continuity, as I said earlier, when we were talking about the reform of global governance, MTPs, IFIs, you cannot finish it in 1 year. So we have to continue that thread and see what will be achieved under the Brazilian presidency, and then see what is left that we can pick up as South Africa next year. Flavio has already spoken about the 3 priorities of Brazil, so I need not go to that. But let me just highlight that these priorities by Brazil, as I said before, are key also for South Africa. Social inclusion, I mean, we know from our experience as a country, social inclusion, social protection, these are some of the initiatives, especially after, as we recover from COVID, our economies. We saw how important social protection systems were, and countries like South Africa decided to continue with the special measures that were put in place to address the challenges of COVID. So we see this Brazilian priority as being key also for South Africa, as well as Brazil's focus on the Global Alliance for Hunger and Poverty Eradication. So this is again another one that I would like to highlight, as well as, of course, the reform of global governance. This has always been key in South Africa's foreign policy, at the UN, at the WTO, in Washington, at the IFIs, and of course with all the MDPs, including our own, the African Development Bank. So South Africa's foreign policy has always been focusing on, excuse me, I think I'm catching flu.
Just see if we can sort out the
Yeah. So I think in conclusion, therefore, South Africa will be hosting the G20 for the first time on the African soil. The hosting in 2025 will be a momentous occasion for South Africa as a country, as well as the rest of the African continent. It therefore presents us with an opportunity to champion the aspirations of the emerging economies and those of Africa. And we look forward to working with all of you as we try to articulate what our priorities will be for 2025. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tolisa. Actually, for sharing the vision that the SS supports the modalities of the view that the Commission should actually play a continuing role that is led by the commissioners for the seat at the G20. And for me, you know, continuity breeds progressivity, and progress equals prosperity at the end. So I think that approach is fundamentally very inclusive. And today, if we want to acquire anything, we cannot do so with financing and resources. So the inclusion or the reform of the multilateral banks, as well as the IMFs, is a very significant way forward. So thank you very much for sharing your views on that. And last speaker, which will be joining us virtually, is it's Hannah Omose from the Economic Commission, UN Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa. Over to you, Hannah.
Hello, hi, good afternoon, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be with you. I think our discussions are coming at a very timely point where we, we're delighted with the progress in having the African Union membership and a chair in the G20. And it's very important to, not only elevate the African voice at the global stage, but to be part of the rule-making, not just rule-taking. And I'll be talking more about this going forward. It's really instrumental at this point in time where we have already the rising debt vulnerabilities, particularly among African countries, that really have them forced to make choose between honoring debt service payments, or sometimes paying civil servants' wages, or spending on education and health, choices that they should not be in. So part of what we need to see within the G20 is advancing the reforms for the debt architecture and the global financial architecture. And this is, I've been leading the work and heading the secretariat for the Africa High-Level Working Group, which is composed of African ministers of finance, economic development and planning. And the group is co-chaired with the African Union Commissioner Muchanga, and with also Minister Ken Ofriata of Ghana. And it includes, in addition to the African Union, African Development Bank, Afrexim Bank, IMF and World Bank. And this group has been for 2 years discussing in detail what type of reforms are needed for the global financial architecture. The asks have been articulated. There has been a resolution on global financial architecture that I will be happy to share with the group, so that we know we have kind of a starting point of what has been discussed, what has been the asks. The resolution has been adopted by the ministers of finance, and also it has gone through the specialized technical committees at the African Union, both at expert level and ministerial level, and will be part of documents that will be raised to heads of state. So I want to just assure the Brazilian presidency that there is actually an clear African position on these issues, and we hope for their championship to move from talk to action in terms of meeting some of this, because it's not just relevant for the African continent, but it's very relevant to the whole global South. And we need basically to have, we are at a point where we have a new global order in terms of economic power. We have, the emerging countries increasingly overtaking, they have already overtaken G7 by 2001. They have taken all advanced economies combined in 2009, yet we have the rules that are set by a few that don't represent even the shift in economic power. So we need to really use this opportunity with the Global South heading these, chairing these G20 presidencies to advance these agendas for the benefit of the whole system, and particularly on the G20 common framework, because I think there is a broad agreement on what needs to be done, but we have not really got to the finish line of doing it, in terms of expanding it to include middle income, in terms of implementing standstill upon application, in terms of having a comparability of treatment, formula. So we need to have a system that is efficient, effective, and time-bound, and this has not been the case. And with all the increasing pressure, repeated global shocks, we don't have a debt resolution framework that is working. And I think that, I would say, would be a top priority and I would say, a major achievement, for the Brazilian G20 to work on and advance. Also, in terms of some of the issues that have been raised, and these are also have been echoed by, at the African level, by ministerial level, of the need to reform both Bretton Woods institutions and the multilateral development banks, because there is a need to have availability of finance that is affordable and at scale. And for that to happen in the current context, we need more concessional finance through Bretton Woods institutions. We need more concessional finance through MDBs, and that would imply recapitalization, but also optimization of their balance sheet, having them take more risk, and improve the way and the tools they have been using to support developing countries. So I think these are really important. Also, some of the very important things would be, for example, and this is relevant particularly for Brazil, making sure that the rechanneling of IMF special drawing rights to multilateral development banks. This is already a proposal by the Inter-American Development Bank and African Development Bank. Yet, even though we have a technically sound proposal, we have not moved to actually the stage of implementing it. And all what it needs is 5 SDR donor countries to commit and provide these pledges. So I think there are a number of low-hanging fruits that can be quite, major milestones in terms of achievement of a G20 presidency. And I hope that Brazil will push on these areas and work closely with the African group and African ministers to really take this agenda to the next level. Of course, another issue that is very much shared with the African continent is Brazil ability or capacity and potential for sequestering carbon. I mean, Brazil by itself has the ability to sequester 1/3 of the global needs. Africa has the ability to sequester another 1/3, yet we are not compensated. So how can we move from just providing the world with a global good to actually getting fairly compensated for what we're providing? And this is a huge agenda that is very much aligned between Brazil and the African continent, but we need concrete actions, both at the regulatory side, at financial incentive side, to make this happen in a reality. So I'm very, optimistic and excited to have Brazil leading this G20. And I hope that in collaboration with the African Union chair, that we will be able to really push the agenda further and get concrete results by the end of it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you for sharing UNECA's role in advancing the global financial architect, as well as the leadership approach that you are making in engaging with the Commissioner Mwenchinga, as well as the President of Ghana, and taking this to the high levels of visibility and to the view of our special technical committees, and hopefully, address a call for debt resolution framework at the Conference of Ministers in Zambia at the end of February. So we thank you for that and the suggestions that you had offered to Brazil in taking forward their role in this presidency. So thank you very, very much for your intervention. At this stage, I think we can open up the floor for any comments, any suggestions that you would like to address from the speakers that were ahead of this session. Thank you.
Also, just to say, if there's anybody online who wishes to ask a question, if you can just lift your virtual hand.
Sure.
And we've got colleagues who are monitoring.
Great. Sure. So please go ahead. It's Joseph Oda. Please go ahead and welcome.
Thank you. Give her the mic.
Yeah, we'll share. Thanks. I'm happy to hear that there already is a lot of work done and making our work a very easy, particularly since we will be building on the great work that was done by India and Indonesia and the work that is being done by Brazil around issues that affect all of us as developing countries. I wanted to ask you, Neka, if there is more work that they have done around global public goods, because that is the health one. It's clear, everyone is agreeable, but can we not push the envelope further beyond the one that you've just spoken to around climate? Is there anything else that UNECA has done around global public goods? Thanks.
May I come?
Yes, Anna, you may. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. There are many issues that we have been working on in addition to the global financial architecture work, the debt work, and also we've been working on advancing issues related to developing regional carbon credit markets. And this relates very much to, the global public good we're talking about. We've also been working on and supporting African countries with, issuing debt swaps for nature and for climate. In terms of also supporting the regulatory changes to make the inclusion of climate clauses universal. So we're glad that we've seen that, adopted by the UK, and commitments made by US, and some commitment by World Bank, but this need to go beyond that. It need to be like, universal and automatically included in debt contracts. So this is something, that relates to the public good in terms of when you have this issues of climate shocks that are very much induced by climate change, whether it's extreme weather shocks. So when you have these instances, at least you need to have the policy buffers to be able to respond to that. And that should not affect your credit rating or credit standing, and need to be integrated in the contract upfront. So some of these issues, we've been discussing. We've also been discussing on issues of, tax convention, UN tax convention, and the need to make sure that when taxes are discussed, it need to be discussed by bodies that represents the globe rather than bodies that represent few. And that's what I talked about earlier, by being part of the rulemaking rather than being rule takers, because it's very important. We need to make sure also in general and for Global South that the voice of debtor countries are there when these rules about debt resolution is being made. So these are some of the issues particularly related to climate, taxation, debt, global financial architecture that we have been focusing on. There are other areas that we have been also supporting and in collaboration with the African Union. For example, the work to have regional blue bonds. This is work that is ongoing with the Climate Commission for Small Islands. So there has been a number of tracks that has been, we've been advancing on. And I think with the G20 finance track, which we will be supporting the African Union in their G20 work for the finance track, both through the Africa high-level working group, but also through technical support for some of the other finance tracks. So there has been a lot of ongoing work. I don't know if you had a certain area in particular, but we have been doing work across many, area specialization and area of work, including for data, including on illicit financial flows. So these are all issues that to advance on, we do need a global support and championship from the G20.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Hannah. It's very comforting to know that you're continuing also with illicit financial flows. It is something that UN ECA has been championing now for a while. And as we heard from Ambassador Kolisi earlier, continuity will always breed progression. So I'm glad to hear that as well. Is there any other comments? Yes, Mavis, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamala. So, Ambassador, my sincere apologies for mispronouncing your name, but I've tried. Is that better? No. I've got a loud voice.
Just that the people, otherwise just use your.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Excellent. So my question really goes to Ambassador Kolisi and Flavio. So on the continent, we have specific issues. So I think, as Hanan has already alluded to, if you were to ask us what should Africa's 2 or 3 priorities should be, we pretty much know what we should take to Brazil this year. Okay, given the challenges we have on debt, liquidity, etc., it's a no-brainer for us in the space of the multilateral development banks that we should be pushing for SDRs along the lines of what the AFDB is asking for. We should be pushing for a real commitment on IDA. We should be pushing for an increase in climate finance. We have very specific things that we can push for. And then when we come back to back home, when South Africa is the G20, hopefully we've won that battle and we're going to the next level. And I like the way you outlined it, Ambassador. It's a continuation. The topics are big, but in each topic are issues of a continuation. I suppose my question to both of you is, you've been in the game long enough. How do we ensure that 2024 and 2025 we are able to make those shifts? Because one thing we all need to be honest about, 2026 could be a write-off. Okay, so we need to be honest about that. We can't afford, I don't think Africa can afford to get to 2026 with lots of hope, knowing that right now there's a big chance that it will be a write-off. So we've got 2024, we've got, it's under Chatham House rules. If it's a write-off, if the Americans decide in their great wisdom that Donald Trump is their next president, and the G20 is going to the US in 2026, I think what we can achieve from what we've seen thus far from his campaign is almost zero. So my question, I suppose, to both of you is, the analysis has been done. Okay, we're not making traction. What can we do to help us make traction? Or is it a case of the analysis has been done, but we might think it's very important, but it's not that important to the decision makers? I suppose we're struggling to understand the entry point for influence and how we help you guys, if you agree these are priorities as per Hanan's presentation. How do we help you take that agenda forward? And linked to that, as a think tank community that works with a lot of international partners, how do we get our international partners to also be advocating amongst other G20s for these priorities to get through? Very long-winded question, sorry.
No, thank you very much for the question. I think I would go back to what Hanan was saying in her presentation, because I think what we need to do on all these topics that you have mentioned, which are very key, is to actually break them down and be realistic about what can be achieved in 2024 and what can be achieved in 2025. Again, going back to Hannah, the way she was talking about that, if you take just the example of the common framework, the common framework is there, but it has not been optimal We know what the challenges are. We know what needs to be done. It needs to be expanded and extended to all countries that are deserving. It's almost going back to the HIPIC initiative, which was an initiative, for all countries that are indebted. So my view is that we need to break down these areas. On SDRs, we need to break it down and see what is it that can be achieved in 2024. What is it that can be achieved in 2025? So we also have, an ongoing agenda, for example, around the illicit financial flows. From the time of the Mbeki panel, their recommendations are there. So this is again an area where I think Brazil and South Africa can work together to move the needle a little bit. The issue of the tax convention, I'm sure you've seen the work of the African group in New York, and it is now slowly getting traction. But we need to bring other actors as well. I think one of the critical players on debt is obviously the credit rating agencies. So we need to bring them into the conversation so that when countries avail themselves of all these measures to deal with debt, they are not penalized. So I think, again, quoting Hannah, she did refer to some of those things. So those are some of that is an ongoing agenda, but we need to be precise about what is realistic in 2024 and then what is realistic in 2025. I think I would stop there, but I think on the think tanks, you are right. I think think tanks like SAIA and others, you do need to reach out to the other think tanks in the developed world, so to say, maybe even outside of, not only within G20 members. I think there's a lot of work that is being done by think tanks in countries that are not part of the G20. So I think that overall mobilization, if I can use that word, to get the perspectives, the evidence-based policies that you can present to us as governments. As I said at the beginning, South Africa is only beginning now to try to articulate what we want to bring in 2025. The 3 or 4 high-level priorities, which are going to be at a political level, but which will influence all the work of the working groups of the G20. I thank you.
Thank you so much. You want to, Flavia? Over to you. Thank you. We see your hand. In response
Thank you very much.
Question. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me try to add my 2 cents to Ambassador Jolisa's reply. I tend to agree with him. We have to be realistic, but I think as it happens, any presidency has also to have a touch of idealism. So yes, we have to be realistic about the results that we can achieve in a G20 presidency, but also we have to propose some things that can be said to be audacious, can be forward-looking, and can be from the perspective of developing countries ambitious and a little bit idealistic, I would say. So, for instance, and this is touching on a point made by Hanan on the carbon sequestration, the compensation for that. This is something that we're really trying to work on. It's actually the #1 priority of one of the working groups, the Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group, the payment for ecological services. I think in the first question, there was mention about the global public goods. Brazil tends to be very cautious about that concept. We tend to perceive that concept comes into play when we talk, let's say, about global health. So global health is said to be a global public good. Very well. But then the resources to fund health in poor countries, in developing countries, countries that have limited resources, that have a much lower than average GDP per capita, those resources are not a global public good. So the global health is a global public good, but the resources to finance global health is not a global public good. The same is valid for the environment. So the forests are a global public good, but the resources to keep them in place, those are not a global public good. Those are only available under conditionalities. So we tend to be very cautious about that concept. And the way we try to, let's say, tackle these very hard issues is by being realistic with a touch of idealism. So the payment for ecological services, that's one very big priority for our ECSWG, the Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group. Another field that has been mentioned in which we will try to be ambitious, although we are fully aware of the difficulties, is the issue of debt, an issue which Africa and Latin America share very much. In Latin America, we also have huge problems of debt. In that issue, something that we're trying to formulate is an idea of debt for social programs. So I think in the past few years, there were talks about debt for climate initiatives. So countries would try to do programs to fight climate change. Those programs would be used to let's say to pay down debt. We're fine with that, but maybe we should consider also debt for social programs. Countries could, prepare, implement social programs in terms of fighting hunger, fighting poverty, and those programs could be used to pay down debt. So in these areas, we try to be, realistic. We know the limitations there. So Lisa mentioned the credit rating agencies, but there are other players there that need to be considered. There's a huge dialogue with China, mostly between the US and China in this field, and it also needs to be taken into consideration. We will try as chair of the group to be realistic, but with also a touch of idealism, because we think that's where we'll be able to sink in the developing agenda in the G20. That's really important for us, and on that we're sure that SAIA and other T20 partners will be able to play a huge role in this year and in the next.
Great, thank you very much, Flavio. I think when I hear the responses of Mavis's question, it is indeed encouraging that the players, the stakeholders, the governments are taking an approach of being a realistic one, and as well as giving it tangible solutions on how they can break down some of these elements and address it progressively. So that indeed is encouraging, and I think we can really say this the approach of Brazil in terms of debt for social programs and fighting hunger and poverty is also very realistic, deals with the social elements, and we thank you for that response. If there's one other comment from the room, thank you. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I'm Saurabh Sinha. I'm from UNECA. And with DES Hannan joining virtually and myself being in the room, it just shows UNECA's commitment to supporting the African Union's membership of the G20. I just wanted to raise one point here. I think it is definitely encouraging what has been mentioned before, that these 4 years where it will be the leadership of the Global South and the G20. There is just one element that I wanted to highlight, which distinguishes Africa's membership and African Union's membership of the G20, because so far, whether it's Indonesia, India, or Brazil, the member is also the host country. In 2025, we are going to have the member, which is the African Union, the host country, which is South Africa, and the issues are African issues. So far, it is the members and the host countries have been championing the issues of the Global South. And what is going to be different, I think, in 2025 by the end of the year, this year, and what we are talking about now is that we are talking about the issues that are going to be championed by Africa. Now, we all know that Africa is not a country. And there are many, many different views and different perspectives on these kind of issues. And I think that is something that also we need to bring together during the course of this year so that we are able to speak in one voice. I've attended many conferences, many events before where there have been challenges in doing that. One of the most recent ones was a couple of months ago in Lusaka, where I attended the ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development. That was a review, a regional review, where on issues of population and development, there have been very different and strongly put across views which need to be harmonized. And I think that is also very important, that here we need to bring in the regional economic communities going forward so that all the views within the continent are taken on board, and so that by the time we get the control and by the time we get the leadership of G20 by December 2024, we would be, AU and South Africa would be putting forth a kind of a harmonious Africa point of view forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you, thank you. I think also alluding to what Elizabeth touched on, after South Africa, when it goes to the US, then what? And I think the priorities of maintaining the African context to create this continuity so that we are not shifted from this cause is very important. And groups such as this, the Africa Standing Group and many other that can take this echo forward and sustain it in a way that brings this continuity. The regional economic communities, most certainly at AUD and NEPAD, we know that having them involved creates regional solutions for regional problems. So we're really, really aware of that. And thank you for your comment. If there's anybody online, I think there's a comment that needs to be made from online.
I was just debating from earlier. There's no questions.
Okay, all right. There's not. Oh, and there's one. Okay, so there's nobody online, but from the floor we have a question as well. Please go ahead, sir.
Good to see you.
Just two things for the group to respond to. One is in the way you're talking about this wisdom agent for understanding people. It sounds like there isn't going to be a vicious and acrimonious fight inside. And everything on the outside says that they're going to be peaceful. The world is more divided now than it has been for quite a while. And how that gets smoothed over by the Brazilian presidency and the South African presidency would be interesting to hear about. The second area is the domain of climate change. There's a bunch of issues in there where the G20 group is talking about. You know, one of those is on the Bridgetown agenda, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the Bridgetown agenda as climate finance being a mechanism to mobilize the reform of the global financial system has actually lost steam.
Oh, okay. Is that better? It has lost a lot of steam since COP26. 27 took it a little bit further. I think COP28, it disappeared completely. Maybe to get some commentary about that. And the second part is that we're already seeing an exploitation of parts of the agreement that's not working very well for Africa and South America in particular, but other places in the world as well. The carbon sequestration as the carbon market discussion, specifically Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, where we're seeing a disproportionate selling off of vital assets from the developing world and the possibility of inhibiting their own development while the global north is collecting these assets, well, global north plus others, I should say, collecting these assets to continue their emissions. And the long-term implications of this are really stark, especially places like Brazil that have these large rainforests, as Africa does, as well as the African savannas. It'd be really interesting to get your commentary as to whether these kinds of issues will actually get into the G20 discussion and how it will play out.
Thank you very much, Tessigan. Also, good to see you after so many years. I think, I mean, the point that you are making is a correct one, that there are indeed contestations within the G20. In India, in the Sherpa meeting that preceded the summit, I think Flavio may also confirm this. I mean, the last part of the document to be agreed was the paragraphs on climate, precisely because there are within the G20 different perspectives on some, especially on some of the specific elements that you are mentioning. I think going forward into 2024, again, Flavio may have a better view on this. I think we need to see, look at the outcome of COP27 and COP28 and see what is it there that can support our work. I mean, do an assessment, and see what is it that can bring together G20 countries. But certainly there are different views within the G20 on different aspects. So I'm just mentioning climate because it was a very big discussion in India, where in the Sherpa meeting that was preceding the summit. And we went on for days and nights trying to reach some commonalities on this aspect. But I think also there's also been a concern from some, especially in the developing world, that the G20 seeks to have an agreement amongst themselves and then seeks to impose that agreement in a COP or in other multilateral fora. So there are countries of the South who are quite skeptical of the way the G20 works and the way in which it seeks to influence key topics in the world. I mean, I think the other area, of course, now that is emerging is the geopolitics. Again, it has been from Indonesia to India. I think the Brazilians now have, I think they are putting certain proposals on how to deal with the geopolitics so that it does not become a divisive issue within the G20. Again, in India, I can share that Brazil, South Africa, and India, the IPSA countries were basically key to unlocking the final decision on geopolitics, largely on the issue of Ukraine and Russia. It was basically the three Sherpas of South Africa, India, and Brazil who basically led the whole G20. So we first led within the emerging markets group, and then we led the whole G20 as IPSA. And that was highly acknowledged even by politicians in India after the summit. I mean, they were congratulating the IPSA countries for working together to bring the world together on such a sensitive topic as Russia and Ukraine. Now, of course, we've got another dynamic, which is the genocide in Gaza. Again, when we were in Brazil in December for the Sherpa meeting, the first Sherpa meeting under the Brazilian presidency, some of us did refer to the issue of Gaza, because we cannot talk food security in relation to Ukraine and not talk about food security in relation to Gaza. But I will leave it up to Flavio. I think they have a particular approach that they want to take to make sure that geopolitics don't dominate the G20 at the expense of all the other important topics. Thank you.
Flavio, if you would like to respond to that. Thank you.
Yes, I would, very much, very much. Thank you very much. Yes, well, the issue of the geopolitical questions and how they impact the G20 is something that any presidency nowadays has to pay attention to. We spent the past 2 years with a lot of pressure from G7 countries to make sure that the group, the G20, would recognize the negative impact of Russia's actions in Ukraine. And now we have a situation in the Middle East which also has negative impacts. And I, as the Brazilian chair hardly sees as the case of not having to recognize it. So we'll very much likely have to recognize that not only Russia's actions in the Ukraine have global negative impacts, but also the situation in the Middle East has to be reckoned with. Cholisa mentioned the brief discussions we had about it in the Sherpa meeting here in Brasilia in December. I think these are very likely to continue. Brazil will host next month on the 21st and 22nd the first foreign ministers meeting of the G20 in Rio. We made sure that there is a full agenda item to encompass what we call the G20's role in dealing with these ongoing international tensions. We don't want to pinpoint which is the tension or the conflict that we're referring to. We would like to leave it open to members to discuss. And we're pretty sure that many countries, particularly from the developing side, will bring up the conflict in Gaza. This is an important matter. You may have noticed that Brazil issued a press statement in a way expressing its support to the South African views on the matter. We also called for a ceasefire to take place. So we share a lot in this matter, and as chair, we will try to play a balanced role, allowing the group to reflect concerns both in relation to the security in Europe and also in the Middle East and also elsewhere if they come up. I just would like to add that I fully endorse Solisa's words about the role that IBSA played in finding a common ground for the Ukraine issue in New Delhi. So it was actually under the chairship of India, but also with a very active role by Ambassador Zain, by Cholisa as well, and Mauricio, my boss here in Brazil, in trying to find a formulation that allowed for paragraph 7 to 14 of the New Delhi Leaders Declaration. Those are very important paragraphs because they resolve the gridlock that was dating back to the Indonesian presidency, when a certain formulation to the Ukrainian conflict was found, which was very early after the formulation was rejected by Russia. In a way, the fact is that that formulation in Bali in November 2022 was reached to allow the Bali summit to take place. That was not the case 1 year later in New Delhi in September. We knew that the summit was going to take place, and we had to find a formulation that was more balanced and that would be acceptable both to the G7 and to Russia, and in a way also to China. So India, South Africa, Brazil worked very hard for that to be reached, and I'm sure that South Africans are very proud of it. Brazilians are as well, and we were happy to contribute to that. Just to finalize by mentioning the relationship and trying to answer the last question, the relationship between the COP process, the UNFCCC Conference of the Party processes, and the G20. We tend to try to be more, I would say, pragmatic about this. I think there was mention about the issue of legitimacy. How can the G20 be legitimate if there's no treaty endorsing a G20 action in these matters? There is a treaty to endorse the UNFCCC process, the COP process, but there's no treaty behind the G20. There's no legal mandate behind the G20. So the way the Brazilian chair perceives this question is that we would like the G20 to be the place to give the political push for the COP process. We would like the G20 to, uniting these big economies. We would like the G20 to be the venue where we can find a formulation that would allow a push to negotiations in the co-process. But we're very, very much keen on making sure that negotiations take place where they are legally mandated. And from the perspective of a developing country, that is also very, very important. In the G20, the split is more or less half and half. So there's more or less half of the group which is developed, there's another half which is developing. From a tactical point of view, this must be stressed, it's convenient to leave negotiations in the co-process where the constituency on the developing side is big. It's bigger actually than the constituency on the developed side. So we also have to play tactics here. All countries, when engaging in international relations, will have to do these types of considerations. So that is why Brazil understands that the G20 is a good place to give political push for matters in the climate arena, in the environment arena, but we must leave negotiations, proper negotiations, to take place where they are legally mandated. So I think that's my contribution to the final question here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Flavio. Thank you very much. And thank you to Desikan for that prerogative question about the insider versus the outside perception. So thank you for steering that conversation. I think from the comments that we have made throughout the session, I'm hearing the words, which is actually very simple words: continuity, reality, relationships. Oh, sorry, I'm just told that somebody else is raising their hand. So cannot see who the person is, but if you're online,
it's myself. Yes, hi.
Yes, Anna, sorry.
I'll be brief, but I just, because some very interesting remarks and comments were made, and I wanted to just put forward perhaps some of the things and the proposals that we have discussed within the ministerial group on some of the issues that have been raised. For example, there has been raised an issue on the role of the credit rating agencies. So this was one of the things that was discussed, and I think, of course, there's the part that will be done at national level in terms of making sure to improve the availability and credibility of information, reliable information available, so that to reduce the level of judgment in these ratings. But also there is a lack of checks and balances and regulatory oversight for these rating agencies. And that's, this is an area where the G20 can come in and can help. If any of us have a problem with their banks, we can go to the Financial Conduct Authority or the independent regulator and complain. If you have an issue with Moody's, you only can go through their own internal recourse mechanism. There is no further oversight that you can resort to. And this is an issue that really need to be raised, that you can have, for example, the Financial Stability Board providing that oversight, or you can have regional bodies, but something needs to happen. It cannot be that you have these agencies without proper checks and balances. So I think that's a suggestion that perhaps can be looked at. Another issue I think that can be also useful to advance more is issues of providing guarantees for debt guarantees, so that to reduce the cost. We have seen before, I'm not going to name countries and circumstances, but we've seen before G7 countries providing debt guarantees in political context. So why not provide it for the global good of climate change and helping countries deal with these issues? So I think this is one that can be pushed forward. Then another issue that is very common between and affecting both Latin American and African countries, issues of IMF surcharges. And there is a interest and appetite, which is just very simple to whoever doesn't know what is this. It's basically for countries that have large access and repeated access to IMF reforms. They tend to have almost a penalty of interest rate from 2 to 3%. which is huge. So most of these revenues or most of these interest payments are paid mainly by Latin American and African countries, and there is appetite, for example, to look at this and to basically go away, like do away with it. So these are some of, I think, very important areas that can be addressed. I had a question for Flavio, but I understand if the time is not enough, because I was very interested in actually in the agenda that Brazil had, the issue of social inclusion as the first one. And usually in the global stage, it's always thought of as it's your national responsibility, not the international, not the global system. So how do you make it from kind of countries saying, oh, we do this, to actually having something, a global system that can support countries to do it? Thank you.
Flavio, please go ahead. We don't have these platforms every day, so it's good that we optimize the comments. Go ahead.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hannah, for your question. This is, as I said in my initial presentation, every attempt to formulate a list of priorities or to formulate a strategy when a country finds itself in a situation as my country is finding itself, having to chair a big group as the G20. It's a lot about a view of itself as much as it is a reading of this country, of the international situation. So there is a reading that Brazil is doing about the international situation, that we need to pay more attention to social matters, that we need to pay more attention to poverty and hunger. The G20 agenda has always been a lot about financial stability. Someone mentioned the FSP. The FSP is actually the only legal entity that has ever come out of the G20. We have produced many ministerial declarations, many leaders' declarations, but the only, let's say, legal entity that came out as a product of the G20 was the FSP about financial stability. And we think that matters related to social affairs, to fighting poverty, fighting hunger, should be more at the center of the agenda. As I said, this is also a lot about how Brazil perceives itself, how the current Brazilian government perceives the need for domestically to push that agenda very, very hard. How to formulate an international agenda has also to do about how the domestic environment plays a role. That happens in all countries. So if you Hannah, if you notice that to be too much of a Brazilian agenda, please, I count on your understanding. There's something that we would like to propose to the world, but there's also something about us, about the need to be more inclusive, about the need to find very, very sad problems in the Brazilian society, the problem of the lack of diversity sometimes, the problem of the need for inclusion, both in terms of economic inclusion, but also ethnic inclusion. This is really important here in Brazil, and this is something that we don't shy away from presenting it to the world.
Thank you very much. This is useful, and I'm happy to brainstorm later on how we can perhaps turn it into global.
Thank you very much, Flavio. I don't think it's a Brazilian perspective. I think when Brazil speaks, it's for the rest of the global south. So thank you very, very much indeed. And as I was saying, and I would like to conclude on this session now, we were alluding to simple words, and we would like to leave with that note on continuity, reality, relationship building. And from yesterday's, the buzzword of trust is very important. But of course, Brazil, keeping in mind the focus of global approach to sustainable development, giving us the support in a political push that you mentioned for progressive, prosperity for all of our countries, but also as a takeaway to access the local think tanks as well as those that are outside of the G20 platform, to leverage on their knowledge and to have them accompany us in these policy discussions and platforms similar to that of today. So I want to conclude by thanking our distinguished panelists. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Flavio, and thank you, Ambassador Xolisa, for your interventions and a wonderful round of questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you
very much.
So, according to the program, we have a tea break now, and I think we can resume in the next 5 minutes. So we have eaten a bit into the tea break, but I think it's sacrificial for the good. Thank you. So, thank you very much, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks, Hanan. Thanks, Flavio. Appreciate it.
Many thanks.
Coming in behind us. So this session is really intended then to sort of drill down into what we as African think tanks can do in terms of research, but also in terms of advocacy to advance key set of African priorities. You know, what we want to avoid is that we have a laundry list also from our side, where we spread ourselves so thin that we're not really in a position to deliver. But let me start more formally now that more people are in the room and say I'm going to be facilitating the session with Mavis Owusu Gyamfi. It is Gyamfi, hey?
Gyamfi.
It is okay. It was Gyamfi. It is Gyamfi because my name has also been mispronounced throughout my life. So, but I take it with a pinch of salt. From ASET, from the African Centre for Economic Transformation in Ghana, based in Ghana. But obviously we have a whole range of think tanks and academics around the table, and also some people online, and we also have some policy makers, and it's really great that Ambassador Mabongo, you've been able to stay with us a little longer, and it's also great to have Pamela here, as I mentioned, and also Joseph Fielder from the presidency, and our point woman on the development working group in the G20, who's also juggling lots of things today, and we're really grateful that you're here. But I'd also like to recognize that we have online, apart from other African think tanks, the Brazilian think tanks, particularly PER and also SEBRI, Fabio, who heads up, who does all the serious running around logistical and intellectual work from IPEA's side in the T20 Brazil. And then I think we may, I don't know if he's rejoined us, have a colleague from SEBRI, Antonio Augusto Martin Cesar from SEBRI, who is also one of the T20 coordinating members in Brazil in the think tanks. So welcome to you all. Let me then just set the stage in terms of what we're hoping to achieve in this discussion this afternoon. I think, based on the conversations we had yesterday and the conversations that we've had today, and yesterday we were addressed by Commissioner Muchanga from the AU, by Dr. Mayaki, who's the former Outer NEPAD CEO. And I cannot for the life of me remember. And of course, yeah, he wasn't online. He was sitting next to me. That's why I couldn't. I just had a complete blank. And of course, the DDG for International and Regional Economic Affairs in the National Treasury, Marlon Gaswint, I'll never forgive myself for that, who spoke about some of the priorities, but also highlighted, and particularly Dr. Mayaki making the point about we need to think about these things in the way that they are significantly transformative for the continent. And he used the example here of sort of economic integration. And so our agenda should be infused by what, at the G20, by what will advance the continent's economic integration, because that's fundamental. And of course, we know that the domestic interplays or interacts with the global. And that sometimes it's not just about the particular national policies that countries adopt that will make the difference in terms of their development trajectory, but it is also whether the external environment is supportive, beneficial to them or not. And so that's the context. So the discussion today has a couple of objectives. The first is really to explore, and this is the bigger objective, to explore how think tanks on the continent can provide support to the African Union now that it's a member of the G20, and of course South Africa in its upcoming presidency in a structured way. We have already sort of identified that for a number of years now we've been building up momentum among African think tanks outside of South Africa on issues related to the G20. And what we have done through the T20 Africa Standing Group is commissioned a number of policy briefings over the course of a few years on issues that are hot in the G20, ranging from very particular projects like the Compact with Africa, which you guys are also very involved in, to issues of debt. This year we have published with the work conducted by the Kenyan Institute for Public Policy Research, a paper on debt. ASET has done a paper on energy transitions. The Policy Center for the New South has done some work on industrialization. A colleague there's also some work on international taxation, which hasn't been, and on infrastructure, that's right. Our colleagues from CC, the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, have done work on infrastructure and so on. So there is already some material that that African think tanks are beginning to engage with the G20 process. There is also a lot of work that ASET has done, which intersects with the work that SAIA and other institutions have been working on, which is the Amplifying African Voices, where a project where SAIA and other think tanks, some of them also around the table, are involved, where the issues range from debt to multilateral development banks to climate finance and so on. And these agendas obviously intersect. And so there is a path that we've identified, and one that I think now with the AU and the pending South African presidency, we can certainly amplify, if I can borrow that word. So that's the first point. The second thing, which I think was also outlined in the discussion a little earlier, is that we have to look at how the fact is the African Union has to represent over 50 countries, 54 countries on the continent. We need to work together to build an agenda where everybody has buy-in and where we don't resort to the lowest common denominator. So how can we also as think tanks provide support in identifying the areas that are high impact, but where we can all come together? And that again then speaks to the point that I think we sort of spoke about a little earlier in the session, which is we need to think very carefully about what we hope to achieve. We'd like to achieve by the end of 2024 in the Brazilian presidency and by the end of 2025 in the South African presidency. So in the same way that we have cut down the Agenda 2063 into sizable chunks of 10 years, we probably need to do something similar with the G20 before 2026, for all the reasons we've spoken about. So that's the second point. And the third point, which is the more fundamental one, is really to, and the session before that, I think, has provided us with a good roadmap, is to help identify the right topics, that it's not a laundry list that we're focusing on, that the AU itself is not focusing on, so that we can really direct our energies onto those issues that can be transformative. In other words, the Compact with Africa is a good initiative. Is it transformative continentally? Are there some of the discussions that we've had earlier today regarding debt, regarding credit rating agencies, regarding, I would argue, issues of access to technology, particularly green technology in this regard? Can those be much more transformative? And which ones do we think, in our realistic mindset, not our ambitious, because I think we do need both, and Flavio earlier spoke about both being realistic and being idealistic. I think you have to set the bar, and then you have to identify what you can achieve. It's like the elephant, you've got to eat it a little bit at a time. But what is realistic then, that we as think tanks can work together on, both in terms of research output, but also in terms of policy engagement, policy advocacy, creating friends of the AU, friends of Africa, to advance the agenda. What we have done in the program we circulated is we identified a few points that link also to work that we have produced with the network over the last couple of years, and it's the issue of debt, fiscal stability, and multilateral development bank reform. It's sustainable development, just transition, social inclusion. All of these critical, particularly also from a South African perspective, food security and trade. Obviously, the focus is on the global. I think the question that Hanan posed right at the end is, what about social inclusion that needs to be global? What about food security that needs to be global? And I think there are some ideas on the table about many of these issues, but there might be others that we need to come up with. Should I? And then the last point is the T20 Brazil. And the two are both separate in terms of the support we can provide to the AU and South Africa, but also in terms of research, but then also what we can feed into the T20 Brazil call for proposals, call for abstracts. We already have around the table some people who are involved in sub-themes. I know Danny is a co-chair on one of the sub-themes in the global financial architecture. I think one of my colleagues is on one of the climate sub-themes, and of course we have T20 Brazil here. Are there ideas that we have already flagged over the course of today and yesterday that we might want to take forward and elaborate and put in as abstracts to T20 Brazil? The deadline is the 5th of February, but I'm sure that Fabio, a little later, I'll give him an opportunity. He can talk a little about that. Let me stop here. Mavis, do you want to sort of add? And then
No, I think you've covered everything you and I went through earlier on. The only thing I'd like to add is there were two really critical points that were made earlier on. Number one is pragmatism. Okay, so I have been in the Africa think tank space for 3 years now, and I have to say, every time I see the list of T20 papers, I can see why our leaders struggle a bit. It's more for us than for them. So today we were told about pragmatism. So when we're thinking through research and the type of research that can really help guide the negotiations, etc., that our political and technocrat leaders are doing in their negotiation, can we try and pinpoint what those may be? And we were given some pretty good framings in that today. That was one. And then the second thing is that it's all building towards a long-term vision. Is that long-term vision the single integrated market? Is that, I love Ambition 2063, but it is a bit of a shopping list. So what is the long-term vision that we are building towards so that we know 2024, this is the research, 2025, in advance of 2025, this is some of the research we can do. Nothing stops us from doing it in between before South Africa does the call for proposals. Nothing stops us from being ambitious and doing stuff in between. What do we want to look at in 2026 if it's a good year, 2027 and onward? So that is just the only thing I wanted to do, which is we as a community of thought leaders really need to meet our technocrats and leaders halfway with what we are researching.
Thanks. Should I bring Fabio in now? Should we do it?
Yeah, I think it would be good to hear from Fabio the structure of the T20 in Brazil so that we can factor that in when we are having our discussions.
Yeah, so Fabio, if you would like to come in here at this point, just to provide an overview that you've done, I know quite a few times, but briefly also for this group. And then, of course, we'd also be keen as we start the discussion for you to intervene and make input. Great. And thanks again for being able to join us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Marbs. Good afternoon to those who are in South Africa. Good morning to those who are in the sides of the hemisphere. And thank you very much for this invitation and for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the T20 Organizing Committee that's actually comprised by IPEA, the Institute for Applied Economic Research. It's a government think tank linked to the Ministry of Planning and Budgets. So you can see that, as Marvis has suggested, we are all the time talking to the policymakers and trying to find how our research can feed into the recommendations and the issues that Brazil is bringing on the table. So that's one of the hats that we actually wore. And the other one is an independent think tank. Even though we are governmental, we have the freedom to set up our agenda and to develop our research. And it's on wearing this hat that I would speak here on behalf of the organizing committee that also includes SEBRI. I think that we have someone from SEBRI also online. That's an independent think tank based in Rio that do research and recommendations and advisory on international relation issues, but covering all the global challenges that we also cover in the G20 discussion. And finally, FUNAG, which is Fundação Alexandre de Guzmão, which is also a government think tank linked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil. Just to give an overview on how we have procedures, so our organizations were quite engaged in the T20 India, so we learned a lot from India, more even than from Indonesia. And one of the things that we, from the scratch, thought that we need to prepare for was to welcome the African Union member think tanks. So for us, it was fundamental. And that's not to say that the African think tanks were not involved in the T20. If you go to the previous T20 websites, they're always there. Not only SAIA, which is like the most constant think tank participating in the process every year, but other think tanks from varied countries have engaged with the task forces, but also submitted the so-called policy briefs that are a little bit like the the prime deliverable, let's put like that, for the think tanks to contribute to the recommendations that are shaped by the T20 at the end of the process. And for that, actually, I would like to thank Saya. It was quite instrumental to put us in touch. So I have been with you in Maizuru. So we had some discussions. Also, we have some partnerships with Kipra. So I saw that Rosie is also online. But you also linked with the Southern Voice Network, from which many of the sub-Saharan African and African think tanks are part of. So that was a little bit of the call that we made actually last year for think tanks to express interest to engage in the T20 process. And that would be basically through the two formal structures that we have. We have the advisory councils. So we have an international one, which we have 2 representatives for each country, and including 2 representatives for the African Union think tanks. One from Morocco, the other one from Kenya. And also through the co-chairs and members of the task force, the so-called task force of the G20. That's the format in which we discuss and we elaborate the topics that are put forward for a specific T20 presidency or year. And for that, we try to have at least one African think tank in each one of the task force. Marvis, I know that you have been contacted by the lead co-chairs on the Brazilian side from the BRICS Policy Center, for example, to be part of the International Architecture Financial Reform. That's one of the key task force. But basically, as you asked me to present a little bit what are the work streams that we are putting forward for this T20 year. The first one is actually pretty related to the first priority of Brazil, as Flávio Pazeto, the Sous-Sherpa, mentioned in his presentation. It's the fight against hunger, poverty, and inequality, and the whole issue of social inclusion. Here, I would like to highlight 2 subtopics that were put in a particular emphasis. And one is the issue of gender discriminations and inequalities, the subtopic 6. And the 7th one is one that Flávio also made a special mention, is the issue of race and ethnic discrimination and inequalities. And why is that important? Because that's also a challenge for Brazil, and we know it's a challenge for many countries in the G20. And we do think that we need to share lessons in terms of the policies that have been applied, what works, and have the international community also looking at these issues. So fighting racism is something that's big and something that we do think that needs also to be discussed in the G20 because it also can hinder development. It's not only a moral and ethical fight, it's also a fight for the development process and for a fair world. So the second one is the one on the climate transformation and energy transition, so sustainable climate actions and energy transition. That's the one that we have Saya as one of the co-leads. And that's the one that you can tell has attracted most attentions. We had more than 52 applications of people wanting to lead in this discussion. And also is the one that's easy to finance. So, and this one, I think that we have some of the core discussions that we have had, and you see what the officials said in the previous session. There are issues that we do need to discuss, including issues on how we are going to finance this transition. Difficult debates on which type of development. Are we selling our chance of developing to the rich world so that we can have this global good of the climate being okay for everybody? So this is the type of issue that we want to discuss and which instruments are on the table so that we can have both the development also fight against climate change. The third one is quite connected to this one because without finance, we don't go further, is the reform of the international financial architecture. So the whole issue of economic stabilization, the whole issue of debt, the issue of also on how to finance the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's something that's related, that may be between the lines of the second priority of Brazil's presidency, that's bringing all the dimensions of sustainable development. So we do feel that we're talking a lot on how to finance the climate action, but we're not talking as much on how to finance the development action. So the other dimension, the economic dimension, how we fight poverty and hunger, but also how we also make available that the countries development so they can also mobilize resources internally to finance the transition that everybody wants. The fourth one is a traditional theme within the G20. It's the trade and investment for inclusive growth. And it's quite important now, particularly with what we're seeing global-wise, with the whole process of reshoring, coming back home, restriction on trade, and what it means for the developing countries. So we want to bring this agenda, the whole issue of how climate is influencing trade policies in the developed world and how this can affect the developing countries. Another issue, as I said, inclusion is the mark of this G20. So we also want to discuss women in trades, micro and small business, and how they could be engaged in value chain, but not only how they can also profit from trade. So that's another subtopic that we have proposed. The fifth one is inclusive digital transformation. Another big topic, the whole issue of regulating the platforms, the issue of the platformization of public service, how this can be a good thing, make it easier for people to have access, but it can also exclude if you don't have redundancies in the system. And finally, the sixth one, it's a little bit on the G20 thinking about itself and its relationship with the other multilateral fora, particularly the UN, is the one where we're going to discuss the UN reform, including the WTO reform, but also, and that's a new topic that was actually together with the Institute for Global Dialogue and Instituto Igarapé in Brazil, we thought that would be important to do. We have a special topic on the Global South and multilateralism. So how the Global South can act together and be more strategic in the discussion in the multilateral forum. So it's huge. And also because, as Flavio mentioned, the G20 has changed over time, even though like the butter in bread was what we have in the T20 under the Task Force 3, was in the financial stabilization and discussing macroeconomic issues. Now development and the climate change became an inevitable discussion. And Brazil is trying to bring the whole issue of inequality, social inclusion, and fights against hunger and poverty. So what we have in terms of practical terms, so we have these six task forces that are led by a Brazilian think tank. None of the members of the organizing committee are leading the task forces. We are supporting the task forces. So we want to be inclusive also in terms of the think tanks that we are bringing in. And they are leading it together with an international foreign think tank. So we have always combinations of Brazil and Argentina for Task Force 1, Brazil and France for Task Force 2, and all that. And we have representatives from think tanks from all G20 members. The only one that's missing is actually Australia, but I still work on it. We think that the time difference, the time zone difference is a problem for them. And also we have this call for proposals for abstracts of policy brief that's on. And we are realistic. We know that people are not going to do brand new research. So basically what we are asking the think tanks is like, look at your research. Look on what of the recommendations that are coming out of your research are relevant for the G20. That's important. It needs to be relevant for the G20. There is no point in publishing things that the G20 cannot act on. And also we are asking think tanks to work together. So we are not going to accept policy brief abstracts from only one think tank or from think tanks whose co-authors only for the same country. So you want to build a community, and the better way to build this community is to have the guys talking. So Guy, I'm doing research on this, we did research on that. So how can we combine and find common grounds to build a recommendation for the G20? So that's a little bit of a novelty that we have. And the deadline for that is February 5th. So, but remember, it's just the abstract. It's not the policy brief. The policy brief is for April. So you have a chance, so reach out to your contacts. You can even talk in the room and put together a proposal and submit it by Monday. It's Brazil time, so you even have the whole day on Monday to build this proposal. So that's it. I think I talked too much, but if you have any doubts, you can, those who are online, you can also write in the chat, and I'm available to respond to your questions and queries. Thank you very much.
Has you signed up, Sven? Sven, you apparently have your hand up. I can't see, but
Yes, thank you. It's probably very small on your screen. It's always when we have it's online. Thanks very much for pointing that out. I wanted to come in. Thank you very much, Fabio, also on the list of task forces. And I think there's a double task. One is engaging in the various task forces and making research from African think tanks being seen and heard there. But also the intervention by Mavis made me think, maybe she said there's a sort of a no-brainer. You have a list in your head of what needs to be done anyhow, and that's been repeated over and over again. With the African Union coming to the G20, why not put that in a paper? In one sort of, these are the core things that we've discussed, maybe identify some low-hanging fruits and saying this is something that can be done now. Here's a longer-term engagement that is needed, and maybe do that as the T20 Africa group, and maybe include Europeans in there as well, or North Americans. Also in terms of the sense of urgency that I feel in saying we need to do things now, because I have the same concern. I hope that came through in my remarks. I have the same concern for 2026 of that being an année nulle, a year blank that we have. Get things done before that and measure success of African think tanks and how they impact on policies. That's the very ambitious part. But also measure Europeans, North Americans, whoever else say is G7 countries mostly, against their rhetoric of we want better partnership, we want to engage in partnership, in saying, okay, if you want to do that, here's the list. You might not fulfill everything, but that's what we see as important. So start with that. It's not new. It's probably not rocket science, but it's a quick win to make Southern voices, African voices heard. And it would fit very well in the Task Force 6 on multilateralism and global governance, I think. Just as a very specific one, and if you're up, my hand is up for that as well.
Sven, that is an excellent idea, and you've answered my next question. I was going to say, which task force is it best in, the international finance reform or another one? So you've answered my next question. And I think the idea of coming together with some very specific low-hanging fruit. So we literally write a paper that is our ask of the G20 in 2024 is in the financial architecture, A, B, C, D. These are not, they're low-brainers. So we can do that really, really easily. So it's my next question really would be to take advantage of Ambassador being here and saying, if we do something like that in the T20, where do we take it in the policy space so that you and AU and other partners are aware of it and can act on it?
Thank you for that question. For South Africa, as we prepare for 2025, we have, like Brazil did in December, we have to produce the issue notes covering all the subjects. I think Brazil issued 18 issue notes, and I think that's where the input of the academia, of civil society, of the T20 can come in to assist us with that thinking. When I was in Brazil in December, speaking to Flavio, he told me that Brazil actually started the process in March of the preceding year. That is to asking the various government departments to produce firstly synopsis, 3-page synopsis of what they were thinking at a high level to bring into issue notes. Then from July onwards, then they were writing the issue notes, finalizing them. That's why Brazil was then able to issue all the issue notes, in fact, most of them already by 1st December, when they took over the presidency of the G20. So I think there is that interface. That is, the framework is already there. Perhaps that is one angle in which this can be done.
I think that's a very good point on particular issues. I know there is a raised hand. What I can't see.
So we have Joe Anderson, and then we have.
Where do you see this?
I've got a good eye. So Giovanni is after Joe Anderson.
I don't see anything.
So, do you want to? That's why we're a team.
Thank you very much, Mavis, and thanks, Elizabeth, for inviting us to be part of this conversation. I just thought perhaps to raise a couple of issues. You said, and I fully agree with you, that the finance key deliverables are the no-brainers. And I think it's important to keep in mind in terms of spaces where some ideas could be concretized before 2026. That in 2025, there will be the 4th conference on financing for development, which is planned. 2024, there is the Summit for the Future. I think a lot of the concrete recommendations that Hanan mentioned in the initial session are also shared by, I would say, the whole UN body. At least I can say from the UNCTAD side, there's a lot of agreement on the fact that, it's time to reflect on the G20 common framework. And I think it's a good idea to build on the continuity of the presidency to say, we have a chance to learn from what has happened and improve those initiatives that were adopted in the wake of COVID. And I think the key elements she mentioned in terms of eligibility to the common framework, in terms of debt service standstill, and in terms of comparability of treatment are clear, well articulated. And I think, there's also a good case to say Africa has this to show to the world, because all the countries that approach the G20 common framework are African. So there's something to learn from the continent. So that is one point that, in my view, would be important. And perhaps if we can have good synergies also with the UN process itself, it could be a way to, ensure that some key issues are delivered before, the presidency's change. On another, if you allow me, on the other 2 points, one is that I think from what we see from UNCTAD, especially working on the impact of the crisis on developing countries, etc., I think it's important to reiterate the point that safeguarding a multilateral system is critical against this emerging risk of fragmentation. And we've seen the impact of this through the trade and investment sphere, how it disrupted value chain, especially for critical goods. And I think for most developing countries, there's no interest in taking a side. There's an interest in preserving key arterias for trade and investment in key goods. And perhaps one point that I was wondering, in terms of integrating the energy transition side with the inclusivity side, I was wondering whether perhaps there could be a longer term idea of developing some principle shared principle, for instance, for issues like carbon credit, to ensure that local communities are involved in this effort and they are not just marginalized to monetize the carbon credit, so to speak, but the same way to ensure that strategic commodities that are useful for the global energy transition are not just basically looted or exported in raw form from the countries that have this endowment, but rather promote a development process. I think these are areas in which, speaking as an UNCTAD official, we are also doing some work. We see in our day-to-day work, these are areas which could be of interest in terms of priorities for both African countries, but also for Brazil. And I just thought I should let you know that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. Can I call on Yul because he had his hand up before? So if Yul can speak, then I'll come back into the room.
Hi, this is Yul from the USA, Atlanta, Georgia. I want to say thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this session today. We are a crowdsource futures research organization. We have been hosting various futures foresight training programs with UNESCO, with the IMF. We've been in Geneva at the first permanent forum for people of African descent, as well as the second permanent forum. And we will be in Geneva for the third permanent forum in April. And we'd love to work with you, Mr. Valensis, on the UNCTAD's foresight methodology and in relationship to the Summit of the Future. We know that many of the attendees have no idea what the Summit of the Future is about. They're badly trained. They don't know what kind of input to put. And so they're wondering in the wilderness what to do next. As far as the G20 activities that has been explained today and the future of Africa and the work that you are doing, one of the things that we see here in the States as far as the Black American diaspora is that the development of Africa is moving so fast that many of the people that believe that Africa is the place for them to relocate, as it is for many people in the diaspora, they want to migrate there. There may not be a place for them as Africa is moving so quickly. It becomes more competition, just like it is here in the States, where the immigrants are basically competing with those people that are already here. But we'd like to work with you as the African American Future Society on expansion ideas on the future of Africa and what it means, especially as you're talking about new financial multilateral institutions and development opportunities, that we need to develop a platform to be presented at the Summit of the Future so that it begins that ball rolling right now. Again, the comments that we're saying need to take hold, and then we need to have some of the new African leaders be participants within that structure. Some of the new coup leaders that are taking over governorships in Africa basically is a response to the fact that they have not been trained on how to process raw materials. And so there's a new geopolitic relationship building in Africa that I think many in the West and European powers are discovering, especially with the Italian Africa Summit meeting that happened most recently, where they pledged $10 billion or 10 billion euros. And the answer is, why would they do that? And they do that to secure their pipeline resource of raw materials, right? But at the end of the day, I think for Africa's development, especially for the G20, there needs to be a stronger push to ensure that manufacturing capacity makes its way into the African countries in order that they could gravitate towards middle income states that is so wonderfully enjoyed by other developing countries. And Africa is the last of the long line of countries that need to be developed. in this capacity. So thank you very much for allowing me the time to speak. Look forward to seeing you at the Summit of the Future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yul. I was going to propose we open it up to the room to get some comments. And what as we are opening it up in the room for priorities, it would be really helpful if in your recommendation you see it as research for urgent research, medium term or long term. What are we building towards? It would be helpful.
I mean, I think there are already some good ideas on the table from the virtual participants, but yeah.
Hi, I'm Danny Bradlow from the University of Pretoria. I want to thank everyone for. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can the online people hear him?
Okay.
Yes.
I want to thank everyone for a really interesting and important discussion that's been very thought-provoking. But it strikes me as I listen to it that you can look at the glass as half full or the glass as half empty. And I think in international relations, and particularly from an African perspective, it's important to look at it as half full a lot of the time. But it's also important to think about it as half empty so that we don't lose a sense of realism. And I think if you think about this discussion, it's changed very little over the life of the G20. The rhetoric might have changed, but the substance hasn't changed very much. I mean, if you look, for example, at the MDB reform agenda, there was the billions to trillions agenda. The capital adequacy framework began under the Italian presidency, not under a Global South presidency. Reform of IMF quotas and reform began long ago and has not gone very far. The discussion of inclusive growth it was long ago as well. Social inclusion is not a new thing in development, just to give some examples. It also strikes me that we seem to be missing some of the changes that maybe we need to be including. Yesterday, I was listening to a podcast on central banks and nature. 5 or 6 years ago, talking about central banks and climate change was a very controversial thing. There was a debate as to whether that should be the case. Now it's moved on not just to climate change, but to biodiversity, pollution, water adequacy. Not every central bank will accept that, but the debate's moved on. If you look at the IMF is now saying that they have to include gender, inequality, climate, corruption as macro-critical issues.
Yeah.
We're not discussing that at all here. And I think those are issues which we run the risk of missing the train if we don't start thinking about these issues and how do we deal with them in a way that we make sure there's an African perspective on all of these issues. And why I think it's so important is because a lot of these changes don't require consensus at the G20 level. Reforms can happen at the base level as well. And in a way, that leads me to think there's a difference between the G20 and the T20. At the G20 level, there has to be a policy, a perspective, and you have to be thinking about what can be achieved during the Brazilian presidency. What are the legacy issues that we've taken on from India that we're going to hand on to South Africa? South Africa has to think a big chunk of what we're going to receive next year is going to be legacy. Some of it's going to be whatever happens in the world that thrusts itself onto the global agenda, as Gaza is doing this year, and hopefully will be over by then, but who knows? And who knows what else? Sudan, we haven't even talked about, which is equally tragic. Whereas the T20 has a different role. Its role is to push the envelope, to be thinking more about what are the issues that we need to be thinking about and what are the new ideas that we need to answer the problems that are on the global agenda. We know that the world does not have answers. It doesn't know how to deal with issues of climate effectively. It doesn't know how to deal with social inclusion effectively. I mean, it strikes me that last year was the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and there's absolutely no discussion of human rights as human rights in these discussions. we need to, the T20 is the place where that can be injected into the discussion. And so I'd challenge us all to think about how do we do that? And maybe South Africa next year can be on the cutting edge on all these issues. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want, if I please go ahead. I think you make a very important point about the T20, and it is, in the first instance, absolutely, and I think we've said this before in various forums, is to provide research that speaks directly to what is on the agenda. But as think tanks, as thinkers, we absolutely also need to think about issues that are not on the agenda, but that should be on the agenda, or ways of tackling certain problems that people haven't thought about. So the innovative side of it. So, I mean, you're absolutely right, Danny. Thanks for reminding us of that.
Susan.
Thank you so much. My comments, I have two comments. The first one, I think Mavis talked about it, the planning framework. I have concerns over looking at only 1 year. How much can you do in just 1 year? So I think it would be good to have the long-term plan. How I wish even the presidency would be extended because you cannot achieve so much in just 1 year. The shortest period should have been like 3 years, borrowing from the budgeting framework that we've got to realize that the annual budget is such a short time. And then we had to move on to the medium term expenditure framework. So how I wish, even G20 could have the long term, just as we have the Agenda 2063. Back at home in Uganda, we have Vision 2030, which we had to break down into 5-year development plans so that it gives you time to plan and realize your outputs or living outcomes. I think that will improve the planning for G20. Two, I'm of the view that most of our development challenges revolve around two major issues. Climate change. When you talk about energy transition, talk about food security, it all goes back to climate change. We must address the issues related to climate change so that we have enough food, so that we can have the energy transition, so that, most of the, now that we have AU in G20, most of the sub-Saharan African countries highly depend on agriculture. So climate change is here to stay and can only get worse. So the earlier we address the climate change issues, the better. The second issue I think that is really pertinent is financing. Financing development, whatever you think about, whether it's climate change, whether it is energy transition, whether it's issues to do with debt, whether whatever you think about, it all comes back to financing. How are we going to finance the plans that we are putting in place, whatever focus we choose to have? How are we going to finance? Who is going to contribute how much so that we have a resource envelope to finance the development and also to bail out those who are debt stressed, who have unsustainable debt. Thank you.
I want to welcome Antonio from Sydney. Hi, Antonio. Just want to welcome you. I know you were off and then you came back in. Welcome. Please let us know if there is at any point, if you want to come into any discussion, just raise your hand. I won't put you on the spot now.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much, Elizabeth and Laura. I had to leave indeed. It's been a busy morning here, but I wanted to participate and to greet you, even if it's just briefly. And I managed to watch the first part in full, and I was happy to learn a lot and to see the presentation of my colleague Pazeto, who was with me working in Tanzania before coming here, and he went to the G20 coordination, and I came to the Africa secretary here at our ministry. But I just wanted to say that the secretary and the G20 coordination are working very closely to try to channel all these ideas and to give Africa the protagonism it deserves and needs in this year. And I personally am also involved with SEBRI, and happy to comment that this week we are having the first meeting of the Africa program in SEBRI, in our Brazilian Center for Foreign Relations, which is one of the, as you know, T20 coordinators for Brazil. So I think I wanted to participate just to greet you and to say this. I think it's an auspicious moment for Brazil-Africa relations and for Africa in the G20, and that's how we see it, how we are going to work, and I'll be at your disposal throughout the year and at several meetings, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to, I think before Elizabeth and I come back, it would be really great to hear from other colleagues around the table. Newman, yes.
Thank you, Bayless. I actually want to ask a question for clarification, please. Giovanni, you made really interesting interventions around the trade agenda. And I just want to, because we've discussed a lot, debt, climate finance, the common framework, all of that. But we haven't really talked about trade. So I just wanted to clarify, when you talk about sort of obstruction of trade, are you referring specifically to what's happening in the Red Sea at the moment, or do you have something else in mind? Because I know the trade agenda, of course, is huge. What I think, because that comes back to the question about, if we are working towards a coherent, integrated vision for the continent around trade, that's a long-term project. We're all very aware of that. But it's really about trying to understand. I mean, just coming back to what Danny just said. Let's also be inventive. Let's be thoughtful. Let's think about what would an ambitious agenda look like, and something that we can all work together with. So Giovanni, perhaps if you can just explain that a little bit more, that would be really great. And if you have any comments on the AFCFTA and how you see it in the G20. Sorry for putting you on the spot, but being in UNCTAD, I think that it's an ideal opportunity to perhaps just hear a bit from how you see it. Thanks.
Shall I respond right away? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. In fact, I was talking a bit more in general, because if we look at trade issues, I would say since even before COVID, we were starting to see a lot of discussions about this global decoupling and potential trade and investment related confrontations between the two big powers, US and China. And that, of course, has also implications for how other developing countries insert themselves into this global picture, particularly in relation to strategic goods, or products or intermediary products that are related to, for example, the energy transition, that are related to semiconductor and other digital related technology. So I think my point was perhaps more broader in a sense, but it's quite clear that if you look at countries' recourse to unilateral measures be it like in Trump's era, related tariffs related to security on certain goods, be it unilateral measures such as CBAM and so on. Of course, there is a risk that these unilateral measures end up being the standard simply by virtue of the size of the market that imposes them. And I think that puts developing countries in a very unfortunate position that they have no say, but at the same time, they are constrained by these rules. I think sitting here in Geneva, last WTO public forum, I think there were plenty of events on CBAM with many different African think tanks, with ECA and others, reflecting on the obstacles that could be posed by CBAM, the compliance cost it will impose on exporters, and so on. The same could be said for the deforestation regulation, for example. So I think it's a more general reflection that I was making, that at a time when we need the multilateral system the most, there seems to be tensions that get in the way. And I think we have a recent example. You were talking about the AFCFTA. We have a recent example about this geopolitics risks hijacking the regional integration in Africa. Just a few days ago, you had Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger declaring that they want to quit the ECOWAS. Of course, that poses huge issues. So I think this is something, I mean, I don't have answers to that other than saying, you know, we need to preserve certain rules of engagement to ensure a minimum standard of compliance with the multilateral order and not just to the law of the wealthiest, so to speak. But I think it's something that will become more and more important. It's something that our research at UNCTAD has highlighted, the growing increase of what they call friendshoring rather than nearshoring, and also analysis from the IMF, from ourselves, show that, for example, since the war in Ukraine, trade has grown the most between countries that tend to be aligned in the same positions in terms of voting and the UN, and has decreased significantly across these two big blocs. These are issues that, in my view, are definitely of interest also from an African point of view, especially if you look at a continental focus. Because if you go in scattered order, well, then it's harder to bargain, you know, as equal, so to speak, with countries whose GDP is 10 times as big, if not more. And on the AFCFTA, I think it's, I mean, I'm not sure that is something that should pertain to the G20. What is clear is that it would be advisable if other partners were supportive of that effort instead of sort of somehow favoring a more fragmented approach in the way they engage with the continent.
Thank you, please.
The remark?
Thank you so much, colleagues. Yesterday we discussed at length, about the need for building resilience, in global South economies and so on. Today we've had, colleagues asking about, what is to be done, about global public goods. We've spoken about what would happen, should a Trump presidency, emerge, and what sort of reversals, could we, possibly encounter. But my concern with all of this is, we haven't, said enough, at least in my view, about pandemic preparedness, and what that all entails. So, if we're talking about reform of the financial, architecture, the need for investment in development initiatives, infrastructure, health infrastructure in particular, and so on. Pandemic preparedness, should be one of the focal points that I think that needs attention. You asked earlier, some of the issues that we need to start planning for, whether be it for this year, next year, and so on. Pandemic preparedness. What if just next year something happens? We're humiliated, I think, as Africa. Not too long ago, when we simply couldn't buy meds, even with money in hand. How do we avoid that? I mean, with all of these tensions that colleagues are talking about, transfer of technology, development of productive capacity, to manufacture the goods that we need, to deal with health crisis and other crises. I don't know. I think this is something that needs urgent attention, as much as anything else. I think. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few comments on this. They're not necessarily well connected. The first is that, as a one-time chemist, we are really in a transition state in the world. High energy, high chaos, serious discomfort. And the reality is that we don't really know where it's going to land. I mean, just to react to a few things. I mean, one is whether or not a Biden presidency actually guarantees the maintenance of a current world order. Who knows? Washington seems to be rather pissed off with the multilateral system right now. And in an election year, very unfortunate statements will be made. Whether or not they stick afterwards, we shall have to see. At a local level, in South Africa, we're kind of at a different scale in not dissimilar scenarios. So I think that there needs to be a pretty serious exploration of some of these issues, but probably using not just a directed research approach, but a conversational approach, a colloquium type approach around some of these sticky issues. Yeah. The second thing that I want to put on the plate is that those who fail to see the opportunity in the current global crisis will remain behind the curve. So, drought-driven blockages of the Panama Canal to almost a point of non-functionality, together with the Red Sea crisis, which may be temporary, most likely not, means a huge amount of opportunity for African ports, surely, particularly in Southern Africa. And that doesn't seem to be on the agenda around how we're engaging this. The whole issue about the Indo-Pacific and the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific is getting more and more interesting. I mean, for a while recently, it's been US and China, but the Indian movements in the Indo-Pacific brings a whole different dynamic into that space. So what I'm saying is that there's a bunch of factors that are right now clumsily knitted together. And one of the things that think tanks can do, because they're allowed to, is to be seriously speculative around possibility. And not recklessly. I mean, you're going to have reasonable data to support what you're talking about. But other kinds of institutions don't have the same kind of freedom. And I really think we have to use that space. I mean, the world really needs different ways to interpret what is currently being observed in the world. The last point I want to make, and it's a difficult point because I don't see an easy solution. In the WIF Global Risk Register 2024, which I gather most of you have seen, although like me, you might have read the free version, which is the executive summary, rather than the full report. For anyone who has a full report, please share. But the number one risk to the global economy in 2024 is misinformation and disinformation. That's a serious concern. And there are many places that need to work around turning that into a much better place. But surely this community of practice has to express leadership in this domain. Thank you, Chief.
I was going to be provocative and say that hasn't misinformation and disinformation been our problem for the last 4 to 6 years? It's been around for here elections.
The WIF Illuminati are recognizing it.
Sorry,
The mic over there.
so I've had a question, yeah.
Just want to add one additional point. I think some very important ideas and very interesting ideas have come up. But I want to draw attention to what's happening outside Africa, which affects Africa very much. And I'm just referring to the summit that took place, I think yesterday or day before, the Italy-Africa summit. And I think that is going to have a bearing on the discussions that take place on the continent, because it's something that engages the other G20 members is on migration and mobility and people's movement. And I'm sure that is something that is going to come up. So that we are better prepared, I think we should have a position on that, on how to handle it, whether migration is good for development, what should happen, because the pressure that one is feeling since we work on migration is that the pressure and the money that is being pumped in by the EU is to keep Africans in Africa. Okay. Now, that is not good economics, and it may be good politics, because the politics in Europe is changing. So it may be good politics, it is not good economics, it is not good development. And what it is going to do is to push and increase more irregular migration rather than regular pathways. And so I think it's very important that we take the issue head on and at the very outside sort of put it out there before we are sort of blindsided by the pressure which will come in from the other G20 members. Because at the moment we are talking within Africa. But let's not forget, when the final document goes and a consensus is built upon it, it'll require inputs from the other 19 or 20 members, and that has been a nightmare. And as the ambassador recounted the experience in Delhi last year, it can be extremely challenging and difficult. And there'll be enormous pressure. I mean, one can see it happening already, the way politics is moving in other parts of the world, even ignoring the outcome of the presidential elections in the US. I think the whole pressure is there. So I think we should start looking at it very seriously on this and develop an Africa position, because maybe East Africa's migration, Southern Africa is different from North Africa. So, I mean, this whole smorgasbord of experiences are there, and I think we will need to bring them together. Thank you.
Anyone else? So I'm going to try and do something, if it's at all possible, just so that it can take us to the next level of the conversation. So yesterday we were challenged by Dr. Mayaki, that in our analysis and thinking through what Africa's priorities should be to have a long-term vision, okay, he threw out that at the heart of it should be regional integration. Today, I have heard from Susan, climate and finance, and I want to put those three in there as well. So the climate challenge, and the fact that climate is an opportunity for us, and financing kind of straddles both climate and regional integration. So in terms of whatever we're thinking around what we're pushing for the G20 agenda, whatever we're pushing for, will it enable us to deal with our financial challenges? Will it enable us to deal with the space we are in when it comes to climate fairness and what all the complexities around it? And will it enable us to realize our ambition around a single African market? And within this, we've heard quite a lot today from the earlier discussions and around the table around issues that are emerging, some of which are urgent, burning issues that link to these 3 points, some of which are longer term, and some of which, sorry, I forgot your name. Yes. Yeah. Some of which are kind of like, if we don't start it's not, some of them are medium term, sorry, and some of them are medium to long term, but if we don't start working on them now, they will catch up with us and become burning issues. So what I have taken around the room, and this is by no means exhaustive, so there are things that I've just collated what has been said here, are the following issues in terms of some of the T20 thinking we need to do. So there's the question around when it comes to finance for us, there are issues related to the global financial architecture and domestic resource mobilization. In the global financial architecture, we have a burning platform around IDA, the common framework, SDGs, 3 things that actually the world needs to stop talking about and just get on and do. And I think we had an excellent suggestion from Sven that we come together and do a single T20 paper on this as a priority for Africa. And we should be very specific on what we want for the G20, what we want for IDA, what we want on the SDG. And I think we don't have to do research on it. We actually have specific asks. SDG, the African Development Bank has done it for us. We just have to pull it together. On the G20 Common Framework, we've all done extensive work on it, and it's been well aggregated. And on IDA, it's a no-brainer. So there's that one. And but in here also, earlier on was a point made around the role of central banks and how central banks are helping us with our financing issues. And then there was a whole conversation around domestic resource mobilization. I think the latter two, DRM and central bank, there are lots of questions that we should unpack, but in there are medium and long-term challenges, because everybody on this continent is exercised by domestic resource mobilization. But for me, one big thing that is on the table right now that we've not pushed is the international tax agenda. It's there, ready to be pushed, okay? South Africa has put some really fundamental tax issues on the table at the G20. Can we pull some of those out? Sometimes I feel like in the T20, we try too clever to come up with new ideas. Sometimes we just need to push harder on the old ideas and explain why it's killing Africans. And having worked in advocacy for a bit in an NGO, if you want anybody to pay attention to you, just talk about the final impact on ordinary human beings, especially children. It works wonders. So that is one cluster. Yes. And the cost. I think we always, as researchers and policymakers, we like to talk about the numbers. We need to start putting at the heart of our analysis the cost to ordinary human beings. All these numbers actually lead to people like you and I in the room. We need to start exploring that. So that was the first. And the second thing that has come up is the whole issue of trade. I think, again, in trade and investment, sitting very closely around regional integration is a lot of research. And linked to a third issue that came up was industry and building green industry in Africa for jobs, etc. Again, linked to the regional integration agenda. The fourth issue was climate. And under climate, what are the big ticket issues we have right now? I think we have climate finance, we have carbon credit, we have so many things that we've been pushing for the last 6 years and not getting very far. What are the one or two we want to push in 2024 and in 2025? And then the other thing that came up was the whole issue of global public goods and pandemic preparedness. I was struggling to see how we put that in the list we have in Brazil right now in the papers, but there are clever people who can help us put it in one of those papers. And then the final thing is the issue of inclusivity. And this is where I feel Danny is spot on. We discussed this far too much. And if we look at the Gini coefficient of most countries on this continent, is getting bigger, not smaller. So is there something that we should be researching ourselves as part of this discourse or not? And actually, I don't know whether it's a G20 issue or an Africa issue, but I'm still adding it to the list because we've discussed it. And then as part of all of this, there were two very valid points made around don't stick to just the analysis, but also stick to how you get the analysis to become influential points. Number one is conversations. Are we in the right spaces for the right conversations? Are we bringing the right people together so that these papers we are producing are moving somewhere? And then the other one is in all of our analysis and in all of our conversations, are we also being rigorous around speculating for the future? So I just wanted to kind of like try and summarize what we have discussed, because one of the things Elizabeth and I would like to do at the end of this session is to leave with a sense that, okay, we all agree that this is our North Star. We all agree that these are some of the research pieces we're going to throw into the Brazilian T20 request that is coming in. And remember, it's just a summary you have to do. And thirdly, we all agree that we will collaborate. And this is something that we will take to the Amplifying African Voices group to expand further. We all agree that we will collaborate to help move the Africa agenda over the next 2 years. And we are, okay, everybody's been very negative about 2026. To be honest with you, America still held global issues and civil servants made it work. So it's not like nothing is going to happen. So getting into 2026 and beyond. Just a summary for us to add, please.
Yeah, I think that's great, Mavis. I think it's been a great summary and a suggestion of a way forward. I think the one point we also have to think about, and this could come out of conversations. I liked Desigen's point about you need conversations on some of these issues. But you know, I was in a discussion yesterday after our conference where we were raising similar points. So it was a Global South panel speaking to Global North. That was interesting. And of course, the important point is, as Dania said, a lot of these things we've put on the table before and so on and so forth. And some of them require key countries in the Global North to give up certain things. And so the question here is, what is the quid pro quo? And I mean, I sort of sometimes think that's sometimes you've got to do things because actually it's for the greater good that we all benefit. But we should also be thinking particularly on some of these issues, for example, on international financial architecture reform, whether it's on the common framework or the SDGs, or indeed on illicit financial flows, because there you're talking about particular vested interests. What are the, can we think about the incentives that would make a compelling case for us to push and to have a response, and to create a grouping of friends that actually are willing to push, because there is an element there that can incentivize and help remove some of the obstacles to that. Earlier today we heard from Hanan about the SDR rechanneling and the fact that you need 5 countries to move this forward. Okay, so that's an advocacy thing.
Yeah. We have 3.
Yeah,
2 more.
Yeah. So that's the other point I wanted to make.
I think it's a great point. So, given that attempt at a summary of our conversation and the point around incentives, we have a hand up. Sven.
Thank you. Just wanted to add on what Elizabeth has said. And I think that's a very important point in terms of where to put. I mean, the first thing is to produce something, obviously, but also to where to put it out. And the T20 does mean it's a G20 audience, but the G20 is different states. That's the first thing. And within those states, and that's the additional dimension, within those states, you have different actors as well. So just taking my country, if you talk to the development ministry, you will find open ears and open doors, and they will nod to many of the suggestions. And playing the devil's advocate, are they the best people to talk to? Or do you need to target other people then? Because who's the influential player? Maybe the chancellery in Germany is the better place to go. And I think that's partly what you can also do with writing down the suggestions. Many of the issues that when you say no-brainers, they will be no-brainers to BMZ as well. But putting that out in the context of the G20 maybe gets it to the finance ministry. That's a hard nut. It's a tough nut in Germany. The chancellery may be easier. So I just wanted to emphasize that point. I think it makes real sense to think about the audience once something is produced, also within the T20 context.
So 2 very quick things. Sven, excellent suggestion, but this is what we look to our friends to help us with. So your suggestion earlier on that paper that we are putting out should not actually be just a group of African think tanks, but African think tanks and their friends in the global north. How do we do that? So then we would look to you to help with the advocacy on your side and vice versa. I forgot one critical point in the list. So if anybody was taking down our list of topics, migration. And for me, migration is an integral part of the regional integration agenda. So Surab and I have been, brainstorming, and I can't remember whether it was you or somebody else I spoke to earlier on who said, actually, we should calculate it in our GDP as part of our growth ambition and part of our ambitions around regional integration. So yeah, I'm adding migration. My apologies for that. So the floor is open after the summary. It is Fabio.
Thank you. Just to try to contribute a little bit to some of the suggestions. I think it's important also to think, and that's something I didn't mention when I first intervened, is the issue of side events. So side events, it's something that's open, so any institution can propose to get the logo and the brand. The only conditionality, as you can say, so is to link with the subtopic or subject of a task force. So someone of the task force attends and documents, and this will also inform the statements of the task force and the final communique of the T20. Having said that, it's good to look at the calendar of the G20, not only the T20, because the G20 are the people that we want to influence, and then see strategically what are the key dates in which we could plan events, either in Brazil or in New York, where the World Bank and IMF are going to have the meetings, and we do know that G20 also organize meetings there. So that's something that we can help you to think about it and how to organize that. The other thing is that as far as I know, I need to double check. So Africa, I was having a look at the issue notes. So Africa is only mentioned in the reform of the INFA working group, so the International Finance Architecture Working Group that's discussed. That's where Africa is mentioned. If I'm not mistaken, I did hear that the government of Brazil, the G20 people, they are planning to do a specific meeting on that with a focus in Africa. So if that's the case, perhaps it would be good to plan around these dates and to have overlapping between the academic meeting or the T20 meeting and the officials ones, in which we can also invite the officials to attend the side events. So I think these are the ways that we can try to influence the process. Now back on the formal T20
Sorry,
process.
Fabio, could you repeat the point on the Africa side event? We missed that.
Yeah, I need to double check that, but I remember in the preparation and the South African sous chef was mentioning. So Brazil started the preparation in March. So there were several internal meetings, and there was this idea of having a specific discussion around one, international taxation that is also of high interest, and the other one was on that. So it would be important to double check with the officials working on the International Finance Architecture Working Group. I can do that and share the information. When they are planning, if it's still on and when they are planning to do it, so that we can strategize and plan a little bit on side events. And the other thing is more related to the T20 and how the T20 can influence the official process, how we can make the way into the final declarations or outcome documents or chair summaries of the ministers. So the Sherpa, they did ask us, the guys from the General Coordination of the G20 and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they did ask all the engagement groups to have the recommendations ready by July, because they do want to use it in the discussions, in the final ministerial meetings. So there is this sort of window of opportunity to make use of the recommendations strategically and to plan in the second half. I know that we have the Summit of the Future in September, and perhaps it's also strategic to have something around these dates, but to plan events in which we have the recommendations and we can bring policymakers from the different G20 members to discuss that. Because then we have the recommendations and we need to see the reaction, and we want to see how it can actually be brought forward in the final declaration, and later on to have the monitor and the evaluation on how these recommendations are following, which is actually one of the topics that we proposed in the Task Force 6. So to see how the G20 actions are performing. So we think that we also need to have this monitoring evaluation dimension of the process. So these are the suggestions, and we can remain in touch and get this information so that we can better plan how to have a higher impact. Thank you.
We need to start wrapping up. Are there any other? Are there any other sort of points to raise, and also things to add, perhaps, to the way in which Mavis has grouped some of the ideas? I think what we need to do now, sort of coming out of these discussions, is really almost to. I mean, I think there's been some concrete ideas, both for potential policy briefings, as well as for potentially some events, conversations. Then there is also the point that you raised, Ambassador Mabongo, issue notes and so on, which I would see as something separate, but perhaps sort of overlapping with some of the work that we're doing. I know you guys are, I mean, I know there's the cabinet Lekgotla happening in a couple of days and so on, and a lot of those are still quite fluid. But some of this could very much also be able to convert, to translate into inputs into your sort of design of the concept note and the issue notes as you prepare. I know we also have an election in the middle, but sorry,
The timelines on the issue notes.
well,
Now, we have not yet decided on the timeline, but I was just mentioning the example of Brazil, where they started in March already to prepare theirs.
Yeah. So yeah, I think what we also thought would be a really good idea is to take some of these ideas and actually unpack them a little bit in terms of priorities as an op-ed, just to get it out there into some of the policy spaces and the media spaces as sort of the input of the collective input of African think tanks and others, but that's a separate thing. We also want to move on that. But I think the important point now is to really crystallize an agenda and a roadmap. Certainly from our side as SIRE, there is we have a little pot of money, of course, maybe not a little pot of money, that also enables us to be able to do some work, commission some papers. But I think the point that Fabio made is very important in the context of the T20 abstract. This is not about reinventing the wheel. This is about getting into those policy spaces, issues that we have already been working on. And I really like the idea that Danny also put. I mean, I think there's value in possibly also writing a paper, a sort of a short insight, so to speak, on some of those issues that are not necessarily being thought about, and maybe we can look at that. I don't know whether that would be for the T20 or whether we do that as a separate thing, but we have some resources. I mean, I know that through your Amplifying Africa's Voices, there are some resources as well. So we also recognize that just in a very practical sense, you know, people have to allocate time, and time is money. So we have something to be able to move the discussion forward.
Elizabeth, I'd like to build on the suggestion you made to Danny and see whether we can maybe collaborate. So ASET, I think it was the Indonesia T20, we put out a note of Africa in the G20 and the history of Africa in the G20. And I think as we get ready to come to South Africa, it would be good to combine what Africa has been, the note we did in Africa in the G20, with where we want to go in the ambition, drawing on your suggestion, and put an aim to get something out. If like by the end of this year or early 2025, when it gets handed over, something, and you know, commit to getting it out, we can get it into quite a few media spaces on, you know, where we've come from, but where we want to be now that we have two. I'm always nervous when I think it's unfair to put so much on South Africa's shoulder, but now that there's two of us in the G20, if that makes sense, or 1 plus 53 in the G20.
I think it's also important to note that this year the Brazilians have invited 3 countries. We heard that yesterday from Africa.
Nigeria.
There was Nigeria, Egypt, and Angola. So yeah. Right. So should I? Yes. Okay. So I think Danny, I don't think you expected that. Anyway, just to say thank you all very much. It's been very enriching. We want to end off this afternoon by handing over to Joseph Filder, Nhlapo Klope, who is from the presidency and leads South Africa in the Development Working Group. The stunning, need I say, Joseph Hilda, a lovely outfit. But if you could,
Now I'm
if you could
shy.
bring this baby in.
Okay. No, no, thank you very, very much, colleagues. It's been a really a brilliant 2 days where we started with discussing resilience and how we need to industrialize, diversify our economies, enhance integration, implement climate change adaptation, mitigation, etc., including resource mobilization in whatever way, whether it's domestic resource mobilization or whatever else, to today, where we are talking about how we can optimize the partnership between the Think 20, the thinkers, and the bureaucrats, if I can put it like that. And it is important that we have the think tanks with us in this journey as we go forward for many reasons. And the most important reason, and I was talking to colleagues about that, is that as we engage and we push our agenda, our is the Global South agenda, we always need evidence to try and shift the thinking beyond the quid pro quo that we're talking about, but just to push thinking and to hope that people will be persuaded by sheer evidence. But also we need it to be innovative in the way we drive this debate, if I can put, as we negotiate this very transformative agenda that we are saying we are going to be inheriting already from Indonesia, India, Brazil, and going forward. We talked about a transformative agenda. It must have be high impact. It must build on wins. It must build on low hanging fruit, etc. All of those are beautiful concepts, if I can put it like that, that we must take forward as we go forward. We know that we have had many projects, initiatives adopted since China took the SDGs into the G20 agenda, and the impact and implementation. So it is important that when we come through, we are decisive, we are focused, we have impactful programs that we want implemented. And we think of programs that are best implemented by the G20 at a global level. So what we still need to finalize is this partnership. How exactly do we optimize this partnership? It's important that we do that so that we are more impactful going forward. And then lastly, we've spoken a lot, we've talked about women. However, the intersectionalities, as well as in order to ensure that no one is left behind, we must talk about First Nations, we must talk about race, we must talk about space, and so on, and ensure that genuinely no one is left behind. And I'm hoping the T20 will assist us with that. Other than that, colleagues, thank you so much. And I hope this is not the beginning, but the continuation of a very engaging and very fruitful partnership between us bureaucrats and the thinkers, so that we have an innovative, impactful agenda, transformative agenda for all of us, not just the Global South. Thanks, colleagues.
Great. Thanks very much, Joseph Hilda, and thank you for being here on both days. Lisa, it's been really great to have you for the entire session, and your colleagues from DIRCO. We also had people from Treasury yesterday, and also from the presidency. So very good to be interacting, and of course Pamela, Auda, NEPAD, and yesterday also and Bernice there in the corner, very quiet, and also yesterday, of course, with Commissioner Muchanga. So we have now taken it upon ourselves. We have been tasked. You can hold us accountable. We need to come out with a roadmap, and we hope to be able to communicate that to you shortly. We may want to sort of have a couple more consultations. But of course, in terms of the T20 policy briefings, I think it's quite important. It doesn't have to be centrally managed, but bear in mind what Fabio has said. It's not a single country, it's not a single organization, a single author. It is about building, and that's one way of building coalitions of support. Clearly, we have a couple of ideas on the table in terms of the making submissions. Certainly, let's reach out to each other in terms of collaboration on ideas that you may have, and we certainly from our side will also reach out so that we can. There's no guarantee that your abstract will be accepted, but we have to put it in, otherwise it won't be accepted. I want to thank you all very, very much. I think it's been a very rich 2 days of discussions. You've all contributed. I think it's been extremely stimulating. I hope each of you have, I know each of you, everyone has made a contribution. I hope you've also felt that you have also learnt and taken something away, some new ideas, and onwards and upwards over the next 2 years, Brazil and South Africa. A luta continua. The most important thing to announce, which our online audience will unfortunately not be able to join, is that we have cocktails just behind us. I also want to just thank Fabio. I want to thank Sven. I want to thank Antonio for joining us for the session, and obviously the collaboration and support we have received. Thank you all very much. Have a good afternoon.
We'll join